Book 3 Trial and Martyrdom. 1. The Maid in Chains. I cannot bear to dwell at great length upon the shameful history of the summer and winter following the capture. For a while I was not much troubled, for I was expecting every day to hear that Joan had been put to ransom, and that the king, no, not the king, but grateful France, had come eagerly forward to pay it. By the laws of war she could not be denied the privilege of ransom. She was not a rebel. She was a legitimately constituted soldier, head of the armies of France by a king's appointment, and guilty of no crime known to military law. Therefore she could not be detained upon any pretext, if ransom were proffered. But day after day dragged by and no ransom was offered. It seems incredible, but it is true. Was that reptile Domrémy busy at the king's ear? All we know is that the king was silent, and made no offer, no effort in behalf of this poor girl who had done so much for him. The English had seen their opportunity, and it was the English power that was really acting, not the church. The church was being used as a disguise, and for a forcible reason. The church was not only able to take the life of Joan of Arc, but to blight her influence and the veil-breeding inspiration of her name, whereas the English power could but kill a body that would not diminish or destroy the influence of her name. It would magnify it and make it permanent. Joan of Arc was the only power in France that the English did not despise, the only power in France that they considered formidable. If the church could be brought to take her life, or to proclaim her an idolater, a heretic, a witch, sent from Satan, not from heaven, it was believed that the English supremacy could be at once reinstated. The Duke of Burgundy listened, but waited. He could not doubt that the French king or the French people would come forward presently and pay a higher price than the English. He kept Joan a close prisoner in a strong fortress, and continued to wait, week after week. He was a French prince, and was at heart ashamed to sell her to the English. Yet with all his waiting no offer came to him from the French side. One day Joan played a cunning trick on a jailer, and not only slipped out of her prison, but locked him up in it. But as she fled away, she was seen by a sentinel, and was caught and brought back. Then she was sent to Beaurevoir, a stronger castle. This was early in August, and she had been in captivity more than 2 months now. Here she was shut up in the top of a tower which was 60 feet high. She ate her heart there for another long stretch, about 3 months and a half. And she was aware, all these weary 5 months of captivity, that the English, under cover of the church, were dickering for her as one would dicker for a horse or a slave, and that France was silent, the king silent, all her friends the same. Yes, it was pitiful. And yet when she heard at last that Compiègne was being closely besieged and likely to be captured, and that the enemy had declared that no inhabitant of it should escape massacre, not even children of 7 years of age, she was in a fever at once to fly to our rescue. So she tore her bedclothes to strips and tied them together and descended this frail rope in the night, and it broke, and she fell and was badly bruised, and remained 3 days insensible, meantime neither eating nor drinking. And now came relief to us, led by the Count of Vendôme, and Compiègne was saved and the siege raised. This was a disaster to the Duke of Burgundy. He had to save money now. It was a good time for a new bid to be made for Joan of Arc. The English at once sent a French bishop, that forever infamous Pierre Cauchon of Beauvais. He was partly promised the archbishopric of Rouen, which was vacant if he should succeed. He claimed the right to preside over Joan's ecclesiastical trial because the battleground where she was taken was within his diocese. By the military usage of the time, the ransom of a royal prince was 10,000 livres of gold, which is 61,125 francs, a fixed sum, you see. It must be accepted when offered. It could not be refused. Cauchon brought the offer of this very sum from the English, a royal prince's ransom for the poor little peasant girl of Domrémy. It shows in a striking way the English idea of a formidable importance. It was accepted, for that some Joan of Arc, the savior of France, was sold to her enemies, to the enemies of a country, enemies who had lashed and threshed and thumped and trounced France for a century and made holiday sport of it, enemies who had forgotten, years and years ago, what a Frenchman's face was like, so used were they to seeing nothing but his back, enemies whom she had whipped, whom she had cowed, whom she had taught to respect French valor, newborn in her nation by the breath of her spirit. Enemies who hungered for her life as being the only puissance able to stand between English triumph and French degradation. sold to a French priest by a French prince, with the French king and the French nation standing thankless by and saying nothing. And what did she say? Nothing. Not a reproach passed her lips. She was too great for that. She was Joan of Arc, and when that is said, all is said. As a soldier, her record was spotless. She could not be called to account for anything under that head. A subterfuge must be found, and, as we have seen, was found. She must be tried by priests for crimes against religion. If none could be discovered, some must be invented. Let the miscreant caution alone to contrive those. Rouen was chosen as the scene of the trial. It was in the heart of the English power. Its population had been under English dominion so many generations that they were hardly French now, save in language. The place was strongly garrisoned. Joan was taken there near the end of December, 1430, and flung into a dungeon. Yes, and clothed in chains, that free spirit. Still France made no move. How do I account for this? I think there is only one way. You will remember that whenever Joan was not at the front, the French held back and ventured nothing. That whenever she led, they swept everything before them, so long as they could see a white armor or a banner, that every time she fell wounded or was reported killed, as at Compiègne, they broke in panic and fled like sheep. I argue from this that they had undergone no real transformation as yet, that at bottom they were still under the spell of a timorousness born of generations of unsuccess, and a lack of confidence in each other and in their leaders born of old and bitter experience in the way of treacheries of all sorts. For their kings had been treacherous to their great vassals and to their generals, and these in turn were treacherous to the head of the state and to each other. The soldiery found that they could depend utterly on Joan, and upon her alone. With her gone, everything was gone. Two Joan sold to the English. M.Y. Wound gave me a great deal of trouble clear into the first part of October. Then the fresher weather renewed my life and strength. All this time there were reports drifting about that the king was going to ransom Joan. I believed these, for I was young and had not yet found out the littleness and meanness of our poor human race, which brags about itself so much, and thinks it is better and higher than the other animals. In October I was well enough to go out with two sorties, and in the second one, on the 23d, I was wounded again. My luck had turned, you see. On the night of the 25th, the besiegers decamped, and in the disorder and confusion one of their prisoners escaped and got safe into Compiègne, and hobbled into my room as pallid and pathetic an object as you would wish to see. What? Alive? No rain guessing. We talked of the personal staff. Old Deolin, wounded and a prisoner, was still with Joan and serving her, by permission of the Duke of Burgundy. Joan was being treated with respect due to her rank and to her character as a prisoner of war taken in honorable conflict. And this was continued, as we learned later, until she fell into the hands of that bastard of Satan, Pierre Cauchon, Bishop of Beauvais. Noel was full of noble and affectionate praises and appreciations of our old, boastful big standard-bearer, now gone silent forever, his real and imaginary battles all fought, his work done, his life honorably closed and completed. And think of his luck, burst out Noel, with his eyes full of tears. Always the pet child of luck. See how it followed him and stayed by him, from his first step all through, in the field or out of it. Always a splendid figure in the public eye, courted and envied everywhere. Always having a chance to do fine things and always doing them. In the beginning called the paladin in joke, and called it afterward in earnest because he magnificently made the title good, and at last, supremest luck of all, died in the field. Died with his harness on, died faithful to his charge, the standard in his hand, died, oh, think of it, with the approving eye of Joan of Arc upon him. He drained the cup of glory to the last drop, and went jubilant to his peace, blessedly spared all part in the disaster which was to follow. What luck! What luck! And we? What was our sin that we are still here, we who have also earned our place with the happy dead? Well, that was best. It was my own mood. We were company for each other. He nursed me patiently through the dull long weeks, and at last, in January, I was strong enough to go about again. Then he said, "Shall we go now?" There was no need to explain. Our hearts were in Rouen. We would carry our bodies there. All that we cared for in this life was shut up in that fortress. We could not help her, but it would be some solace to us to be near her, to breathe the air that she breathed, and look daily upon the stone walls that hid her. What if we should be made prisoners there? Well, we could but do our best and let luck and fate decide what should happen. And so we started. We could not realize the change which had come upon the country. We seemed able to choose our own route and go whenever we pleased, unchallenged and unmolested. When Joan of Arc was in the field, there was a sort of panic of fear everywhere, but now that she was out of the way, fear had vanished. Nobody was troubled about you or afraid of you. Nobody was curious about you or your business. Everybody was indifferent. We had no trouble. We stopped in the plain with a family of peasants and stayed a week, helping them with their work for board and lodging, and making friends of them. We got clothes like theirs, and wore them. When we had worked our way through their reserves and gotten their confidence, we found that they secretly harbored French hearts in their bodies. Then we came out frankly and told them everything, and found them ready to do anything they could to help us. 1. It remained there 360 years, and then was destroyed in a public bonfire, together with 2 swords, a plume cap, several suits of state apparel, and other relics of the maid, by a mob in the time of the Revolution. Nothing which the hand of Joan of Arc is known to have touched now remains in existence except a few preciously guarded military and state papers which he signed, her pen being guided by a clerk or her secretary, Louis de Conte. A boulder exists from which he is known to have mounted her horse when she was once setting out upon a campaign. Up to a quarter of a century ago, there was a single hair from a head still in existence. It was drawn through the wax of a seal attached to the parchment of a state document. It was surreptitiously snipped out, seal and all, by some vandal relic hunter, and carried off. Doubtless it still exists, but only the thief knows where. Translator. 3. Weaving the net about her. It was necessary for me to have some way to gain bread for Noel and myself, and when the Purons found that I knew how to write, they applied to their confessor in my behalf, and he got a place for me with a good priest named Mansion, who was to be the chief recorder in the great trial of Joan of Arc now approaching. It was a strange position for me, clerk to the recorder, and dangerous if my sympathies and the late employment should be found out. But there was not much danger. Mansion was at bottom friendly to Joan and would not betray me, and my name would not, for I had discarded my surname and retained only my given one, like a person of low degree. I attended Mansion constantly straight along, out of January and into February, and was often in the citadel with him, in the very fortress where Joan was imprisoned, though not in the dungeon where she was confined, and so did not see her, of course. Mansion told me everything that had been happening before my coming. Ever since the purchase of Joan, Caution had been busy packing his jewelry for the destruction of the maid. Weeks and weeks he had spent in this bad industry. The University of Paris had sent him a number of learned and able and trusty ecclesiastics of the stripe he wanted, and he had scraped together clergymen of like stripe and great fame here and there and yonder, until he was able to construct a formidable court numbering 100 distinguished names. French names they were, but their interests and sympathies were English. Rouen was not in his diocese. Joan had not been arrested in her domicile, which was still Domrémy, and finally this proposed judge was a prisoner's outspoken enemy, and therefore he was incompetent to try her. Yet all these large difficulties were gotten rid of. The territorial chapter of Rouen finally granted territorial letters to Caution, though only after a struggle and under compulsion. Force was also applied to the inquisitor, and he was obliged to submit. So then, the little English king, by his representative, formally delivered Joan into the hands of the court, but with this reservation: if the court failed to condemn her, he was to have her back again. What chance was there for that forsaken and friendless child? Friendless, indeed, it is the right word, for she was in a black dungeon, with 6 brutal common soldiers keeping guard night and day in the room where her cage was, for she was in a cage, an iron cage, and chained to a bed by neck and hands and feet. Never a person near whom she had ever seen before, never a woman at all. Yes, this was, indeed, friendlessness. Name of God, you but mock me. I know that you have neither the power nor the will to do it. He insisted. Then the pride and dignity of the soldier rose in Joan, and she lifted her chained hands and let them fall with a clash, saying, "Though there were 100,000 of them, they would never get it." This defiance infuriated Stafford, and now think of it, he a free, strong man, she a chained and helpless girl. He drew his dagger and flung himself at her to stab her. But Warwick seized him and held him back. Warwick was wise. Take her life in that way. Send her to heaven stainless and undisgraced. It would make her the idol of France, and the whole nation would rise and march to victory and emancipation under the inspiration of her spirit. No, she must be saved for another fate than that. Well, the time was approaching for the great trial. For more than 2 months, Caution had been raking and scraping everywhere for any odds and ends of evidence or suspicion or conjecture that might be usable against Joan, and carefully suppressing all evidence that came to hand in her favor. He had limitless ways and means and powers at his disposal for preparing and strengthening the case for the prosecution, and he used them all. But Joan had no one to prepare her case for her, and she was shut up in those stone walls and had no friend to appeal to for help. And as for witnesses, she could not call a single one in her defense. They were all far away, under the French flag, and this was an English court. They would have been seized and hanged if they had shown their faces at the gates of Rouen. No, the prisoner must be the sole witness, witness for the prosecution, witness for the defense, and with a verdict of death resolved upon before the doors were opened for the court's first sitting. When she learned that the court was made up of ecclesiastics in the interest of the English, she begged that in fairness an equal number of priests of the French party should be added to these. Caution scoffed at her message, and would not even deign to answer it. By the law of the Church, she being a minor under 21, it was a right to have counsel to conduct a case, advise her how to answer when questioned, and protect her from falling into traps set by cunning devices of the prosecution. She probably did not know that this was her right, and that she could demand it and require it, for there was none to tell her that. But she begged for this help at any rate. Caution refused it. She urged and implored, pleading her youth and her ignorance of the complexities and intricacies of the law and of legal procedure. Caution refused again, and said she must get along with her case as best she might by herself. Ah! His heart was a stone. Now, by the law of the Church, a trial of that sort could not be begun until a searching inquiry had been made into the history and character of the accused, and it was essential that the result of this inquiry be added to the process verbal and form a part of it. You remember that was the first thing they did before the trial at Poitiers. They did it again now. An ecclesiastic was sent to Domrémy. There and all about the neighborhood he made an exhaustive search into Joan's history and character, and came back with his verdict. It was very clear. The searcher reported that he found Joan's character to be in every way what he would like his own sister's character to be. Just about the same report that was brought back to Poitiers. You see, Joan's was a character which could endure the minutest examination. This verdict was a strong point for Joan, you will say. Yes, it would have been if it could have seen the light. But Caution was awake, and it disappeared from the process verbal before the trial. People were prudent enough not to inquire what became of it. One would imagine that Caution was ready to begin the trial by this time. But no. He devised one more scheme for poor Joan's destruction, and it promised to be a deadly one. She was filled with gladness to see one from the hills and plains that was so dear to her, happier still to look upon a priest and disburden her heart in confession, for the offices of the church were the bread of life, the breath of her nostrils to hair, and she had been long forced to pine for them in vain. She opened her whole innocent heart to this creature, and in return he gave her advice concerning her trial which could have destroyed her if her deep native wisdom had not protected her against following it. You will ask, what value could this scheme have, since the secrets of the confessional are sacred and cannot be revealed? True, but suppose another person should overhear them? That person is not bound to keep the secret. Well, that is what happened. Caution had previously caused a hole to be bored through the wall, and he stood with his ear to that hole and heard all. It is pitiful to think of these things. One wonders how they could treat that poor child so. She had not done them any harm. Four already to condemn. Of course I had been expecting such news every day for many days. But no matter, the shock of it almost took my breath away and set me trembling like a leaf. I suppose that without knowing it, I had been half imagining that at the last moment something would happen, something that would stop this fatal trial. Maybe that Lahire would burst into the gates with his hellions at his back. Maybe that God would have pity and stretch forth his mighty hand. But now there was no hope. The trial was to begin in the chapel of the fortress and would be public. So I went sorrowing away and told Noel, so that he might be their early and secure place. It would give him a chance to look again upon the face which we so revered and which was so precious to us. All the way, both going and coming, I plowed through chattering and rejoicing multitudes of English soldiery and English-hearted French citizens. There was no talk but of the coming event. Many times I heard the remark, accompanied by a pitiless laugh. But here and there I glimpsed compassion and distress in a face, and it was not always a French one. English soldiers feared Joan, but they admired her for her great deeds and her unconquerable spirit. When I look around upon this army of masters of legal fence, gathered here to find just one verdict and no other, and remember that Joan must fight for a good name and a life single-handed against them, I ask myself what chance an ignorant poor country girl of 19 could have in such an unequal conflict, and my heart sank down low, very low. When I looked again at that obese president, puffing and wheezing there, his great belly distending and receding with each breath, and noted his 3 chins, fold above fold, and his knobby and knotty face, and his purple and splotchy complexion, and his repulsive cauliflower nose, and his cold and malignant eyes, a brute, every detail of him, my heart sank lower still. And when I noted that all were afraid of this man, and shrank and fidgeted in their seats when his eye smote theirs, my last poor ray of hope dissolved away and wholly disappeared. There was one unoccupied seat in this place, and only one. It was over against the wall, in view of everyone. It was a little wooden bench without a back, and it stood apart and solitary on a sort of dais. Tall men-at-arms in morion, breastplate, and steel gauntlets stood as stiff as their own halberds on each side of this dais, but no other creature was nearby it. A pathetic little bench to me it was, for I knew whom it was for, and the sight of it carried my mind back to the great court of Poitiers, where Joan sat upon one like it and calmly fought a cunning fight with the astonished doctors of the church and parliament, and rose from it victorious and applauded by all, and went forth to fill the world with the glory of her name. What a dainty little figure she was, and how gentle and innocent, how winning and beautiful in the fresh bloom of her 17 years. Those were grand days. And so recent, for she was just 19 now, and how much she had seen since, and what wonders she had accomplished. The stillness continued. Then, far down the stone-paved corridors, one heard a vague, slow sound approaching. Clank, clink, clank, Joan of Arc, deliverer of France, in chains. My head swam. All things whirled and spun about me. I was realizing, too, 550 experts against a novice. There will be only this difference, that in talking familiarly with you, I shall use my right to comment upon the proceedings and explain them as I go along, so that you can understand them better. Also, I shall throw in trifles which came under our eyes and have a certain interest for you and me, but were not important enough to go into the official record. 1. To take up my story now where I left off. We heard the clanking of Joan's chains down the corridors. She was approaching. She moved to her place and mounted the dais and seated herself upon a bench, gathering her chains into her lap and nestling her little white hands there. Then she waited in tranquil dignity, the only person there who seemed unmoved and unexcited. A bronze and brawny English soldier, standing at martial ease in the front rank of the citizen spectators, did now most gallantly and respectfully put up his great hand and give her the military salute, and she, smiling friendly, put up hers and returned it, whereat there was a sympathetic little break of applause, which the judge sternly silenced. Now the memorable Inquisition, called in history, the great trial began. 50 experts against a novice, and no one to help the novice. The judge summarized the circumstances of the case and the public reports and suspicions upon which it was based. Then he required Joan to kneel and make oath that she would answer with exact truthfulness to all questions asked her. Joan's mind was not asleep. It suspected that dangerous possibilities might lie hidden under this apparently fair and reasonable demand. She answered with the simplicity which so often spoiled the enemy's best-laid plans in the trial of Poitiers, and said, "No, for I do not know what you are going to ask me. You might ask me things which I would not tell you." Joan said, with composure, "As concerning my father and mother, and the faith, and what things I have done since my coming into France, I will gladly answer, but as regards the revelations which I have received from God, my voices have forbidden me to confide them to any save my king." Here there was another angry outburst of threats and expletives, and much movement and confusion. So she had to stop and wait for the noise to subside. Then her waxen face flushed a little, and she straightened up and fixed her eye on the judge, and finished a sentence in a voice that had the old ring to it. "Well, maybe you know what a deliberative body of Frenchmen is like." The judge and half the court were on their feet in a moment, and all shaking their fists at the prisoner, and all storming and vituperating at once, so that you could hardly hear yourself think. They kept this up several minutes, and because Joan sat untroubled and indifferent, they grew madder and noisier all the time. Once she said, with a fleeting trace of the old-time mischief in her eye and manner, "Prithee, speak one at a time. Fair lords, then I will answer all of you." At the end of 3 whole hours of furious debating over the oath, the situation had not changed a jot. The bishop was still requiring an unmodified oath. Joan was refusing for the 20th time to take any except the one which she had herself proposed. There was a physical change apparent, but it was confined to the court and judge. They were hoarse, droopy, exhausted by their long frenzy, and had a sort of haggard look in their faces. Poor men, whereas Joan was still placid and reposeful and did not seem noticeably tired. The noise quieted down. There was a waiting pause of some moments' duration. Then the judge surrendered to the prisoner, and with bitterness in his voice told her to take the oath after her own fashion. Joan sunk at once to her knees, and as she laid her hands upon the Gospels, the big English soldier set free his mind. By God, if she were but English, she were not in this place another half a second. It was the soldier in him responding to the soldier in her. But what a stinging rebuke it was! What an arraignment of French character and French royalty! Would that he could have uttered just that one phrase in the hearing of Orleans. I know that that grateful city, that adoring city, would have risen to the last man and the last woman and marched upon Rouen. Some speeches that shame a man and humble him, burn themselves into the memory and remain there. That one is burned into mine. After Joan had made oath, Caution asked her name and where she was born, and some questions about her family, also what her age was. She answered these. Then he asked her how much education she had. "I have learned from my mother the Pater Noster, the Ave Maria, and the belief. All that I know was taught me by my mother. I am not bound by this proposition. If I could escape, I would not reproach myself, for I have given no promise, and I shall not." Then she complained of the burden of her chains, and asked that they might be removed, for she was strongly guarded in the dungeon and there was no need of them. But the bishop refused, and reminded her that she had broken out of prison twice before. Joan of Arc was too proud to insist. She only said, as she rose to go with the guard, "It is true, I have wanted to escape, and I do want to escape." Then she added, in a way that would touch the pity of anybody, "I think it is the right of every prisoner." We walked slowly home together, each busy with his own grief and saying not a word. He kept his word. His account of the great trial will be found to be in strict and detailed accordance with the sworn facts of history. Translator. That night Mansion told me that all through the day's proceedings Caution had some clerks concealed in the embrasure of a window who were to make a special report garbling Joan's answers and twisting them from their right meaning. Aye, that was surely the cruelest man and the most shameless that has lived in this world. But his scheme failed. Those clerks had human hearts in them, and their base work revolted them, and they turned to and boldly made a straight report, whereupon Caution cursed them and ordered them out of his presence with a threat of drowning, which was his favorite and most frequent menace. The matter had gotten abroad and was making great and unpleasant talk, and Caution would not try to repeat this shabby game right away. It comforted me to hear that. The prisoner was brought in. She was as white as ever, but she was looking no whit worse than she looked when she had first appeared the day before. Isn't it a strange thing? Yesterday she had sat 5 hours on that backless bench with her chains in her lap, baited, badgered, persecuted by that unholy crew, without even the refreshment of a cup of water, for she was never offered anything, and if I have made you know her by this time, you will know without my telling you that she was not a person likely to ask favors of those people. And she had spent the night caged in her wintry dungeon with her chains upon her. Yet here she was, as I say, collected, unworn, and ready for the conflict. Yes, and the only person there who showed no signs of the wear and worry of yesterday. And her eyes, you should have seen them and broken your hearts. Have you seen that veiled deep glow, that pathetic hurt dignity, that unsubdued and unsubduable spirit that burns and smolders in the eye of a caged eagle and makes you feel mean and shabby under the burden of its mute reproach? Her eyes were like that. How capable they were, and how wonderful. Yes, at all times and in all circumstances they could express as by print every shade of the wide range of her moods. In them were hidden floods of gay sunshine, the softest and peacefulest twilights, and devastating storms and lightnings. Not in this world had there been others that were comparable to them. Such is my opinion, and none that had the privilege to see them would say otherwise than this which I have said concerning them. You are required now to take the oath pure and simple, to answer truly all questions asked you. I have made oath yesterday, my lord, let that suffice. The bishop insisted and insisted. With rising temper, Joan but shook her head and remained silent. At last she said, I made oath yesterday, it is sufficient. Then she sighed and said, of a truth, you do burden me too much. The bishop still insisted, still commanded, but he could not move her. At last he gave it up and turned her over for the day's inquest to an old hand at tricks and traps and deceptive plausibilities. Beaupere, a doctor of theology, now noticed the form of this sleek strategist's first remark, flung out in an easy, offhand way that would have thrown any unwatchful person off his guard. Now, Joan, the matter is very simple. Just speak up and frankly and truly answer the questions which I'm going to ask you, as you have sworn to do. It was a failure. Joan was not asleep. She saw the artifice. She said, Beaupere changed his attack and began an approach from another quarter. He would slip upon her, you see, under cover of innocent and unimportant questions. Did you learn any trade at home? Yes, to sew and to spin. Then the invincible soldier, victor of Patay, conqueror of the Lion Talbot, deliverer of Orleans, restorer of a king's crown, commander-in-chief of a nation's armies, straightened herself proudly up, gave her head a little toss, and said with naive complacency, and when it comes to that, I am not afraid to be matched against any woman in Rouen. The crowd of spectators broke out with applause, which pleased Joan, and there was many a friendly and petting smile to be seen. But caution stormed at the people and warned them to keep still and mind their manners. Had you other occupations at home? Her voice trembled a little, but one could hardly notice it. As for me, it brought those old enchanted days flooding back to me, and I could not see what I was writing for a little while. Beaupere cautiously edged along up with other questions toward the forbidden ground, and finally repeated a question which he had refused to answer a little while back, as to whether she had received the Eucharist in those days at other festivals than that of Easter. Joan merely said, Pass as outer. Or, as one might say, pass on to matters which you are privileged to pry into. As a rule, witnesses are but dull creatures, and an easy prey, yes, and easily embarrassed, easily frightened, but truly one can neither scare this child nor find her dozing. When did you first hear these voices? I was 13 when I first heard a voice coming from God to help me to live well. I was frightened. It came at midday, in my father's garden in the summer. Had you been fasting? Yes. The day before? No. From what direction did it come? From the right, from toward the church. What did the voice sound like? You could understand it. Quite easily. It was always clear. What advice did it give you as to the salvation of your soul? It told me to live rightly and be regular in attendance upon the services of the church. And it told me that I must go to France. In what species of form did the voice appear? Joan looked suspiciously at her priest a moment, then said, tranquilly, "As to that, I will not tell you." Did the voice seek you often? Did your father know about your departure? What else did it say? Was that all? No, I was to go to Vaucouleurs, and Robert de Baudricourt would give me soldiers to go with me to France. And I answered, saying that I was a poor girl who did not know how to ride, neither how to fight. Then she told how she was balked and interrupted at Vaucouleurs, but finally got her soldiers, and began her march. How were you dressed? Who was it that advised you to wear the dress of a man? Joan was suspicious again. She would not answer. She refused again. So Beaupère gave up the matter for the present. What did Baudricourt say to you when you left? He made them that were to go with me promise to take charge of me, and to me said, "Go, and let happen what may. Advienne que pourra." After a good deal of questioning upon other matters, she was asked again about her attire. She said it was necessary for her to dress as a man. Joan merely answered placidly, "I believe my voice gave me good advice." It was all that could be got out of her, so the questions wandered to other matters, and finally to her first meeting with the king at Chinon. She said she chose out the king, who was unknown to her, by the revelation of her voices. All that happened at that time was gone over. Finally, do you still hear those voices? They come to me every day. What do you ask of them? He is creeping upon her again. She answered, "It required me to remain behind at St. Denis. I would have obeyed if I had been free, but I was helpless by my wound, and the knights carried me away by force." When were you wounded? Was it a feast day? Joan was troubled a moment. Then she answered yes, it was a feast day. Passes outer. Smiles danced for a moment in some of the sternest faces there, and several men even laughed outright. The trap had been long and laboriously prepared. It fell and was empty. Mansion and several of the judges who had been members of our court were among the witnesses who appeared before that tribunal of rehabilitation. Recalling these miserable proceedings which I have been telling you about, Mansion testified thus. Here you have it, all in fair print in the unofficial history. When Joan spoke of her apparitions, she was interrupted at almost every word. They wearied her with long and multiplied interrogatories upon all sorts of things. Almost every day the interrogatories of the morning lasted 3 or 4 hours. Then from these morning interrogatories they extracted the particularly difficult and subtle points, and these served as material for the afternoon interrogatories, which lasted 2 or 3 hours. Moment by moment they skipped from one subject to another. Yet in spite of this she always responded with an astonishing wisdom and memory. She often corrected the judges, saying, "But I have already answered that once before. Ask the recorder," referring them to me. And here is the testimony of one of Joan's judges. Remember, these witnesses are not talking about 2 or 3 days. They are talking about a tedious long procession of days. They asked her profound questions, but she extricated herself quite well. Sometimes the questioners changed suddenly and passed on to another subject to see if she would not contradict herself. They burdened her with long interrogatories of 2 or 3 hours, from which the judges themselves went forth fatigued. From the snares with which he was beset, the expertest man in the world could not have extricated himself but with difficulty. She gave her responses with great prudence, indeed to such a degree that during 3 weeks I believed she was inspired. Ah! Had she a mind such as I have described? You see what these priests say under oath. Pick men chosen for their places in that terrible court on account of their learning, their experience, their keen and practiced intellects, and their strong bias against the prisoner. They make that poor country girl out the match, and more than the match, of the 62 trained adepts. Isn't it so? They from the University of Paris, she from the sheepfold and the cow stable. 7 craft that was in vain. The third meeting of the court was in that same spacious chamber. Next day, 24th of February. Joan's eyes kindled, and she rose and stood, fine and noble, and faced toward the bishop and said. It made a great stir, and caution burst out upon her with an awful threat, the threat of instant condemnation unless she obeyed, that made the very bones of my body turn cold, and I saw cheeks about me blanch, for it meant fire and the stake. But Joan, still standing, answered him back, proud and undismayed. Not all the clergy in Paris and Rouen could condemn me, lacking the right. This made a great tumult, and part of it was applause from the spectators. Joan resumed her seat. I have already made oath. It is enough. The bishop shouted. In refusing to sway, you place yourself under suspicion. The bishop continued to insist. Joan answered that she would tell what she knew, but not all that she knew. The bishop plagued her straight along, till at last she said, in a weary tone, I came from God. I have nothing more to do here. Return me to God, from whom I came. Once more I command you to. Joan cut in with a nonchalant passes outer, and caution retired from the struggle, but he retired with some credit this time, for he offered a compromise, and Joan, always clear-headed, saw protection for herself in it and promptly and willingly accepted it. She was to swear to tell the truth, as touching the matters set down in the process verbal. They could not sail her outside of definite limits. Now, her course was over charted sea. Henceforth, the bishop had granted more than he had intended, and more than he would honestly try to abide by. If the least thing had passed her lips in the nature of sustenance, neither her youth nor the fact that she was being half-starved in her prison could save her from dangerous suspicion of contempt for the commandments of the church. I have done neither since yesterday at noon. The priest shifted to the voices again. When have you heard your voice? Yesterday and today. At what time? Yesterday it was in the morning. What were you doing then? By touching your arm. No, without touching me. He had Satan in his mind, you see, and was hoping, perhaps, that by and by it could be shown that she had rendered homage to the arch-enemy of God and man. Yes, I thanked it, and knelt in my bed where I was chained, and joined my hands and begged it to implore God's help for me so that I might have light and instruction as touching the answers I should give here. Then what did the voice say? It told me to answer boldly, and God would help me. Then she turned toward caution and said, You say that you are my judge. Now I tell you again, take care what you do, for in truth I am sent of God, and you are putting yourself in great danger. Beaupère asked her if the voice's counsels were not fickle and variable. No, it never contradicts itself. This very day it has told me again to answer boldly. Has it forbidden you to answer only part of what is asked you? I will tell you nothing as to that. I have revelations touching the king my master, and those I will not tell you. Then she was stirred by a great emotion, and the tears sprang to her eyes, and she spoke out, as with strong conviction, saying, being questioned further concerning the voice, she said she was not at liberty to tell all she knew. Do you think God will be displeased at your telling the whole truth? The voice has commanded me to tell the king certain things, and not you, and some very lately, even last night, things which I would he knew. He would be more easy at his dinner. Why doesn't the voice speak to the king itself, as it did when you were with him? Would it not if you asked it? I do not know if it be the wish of God. She was pensive a moment or two, busy with her thoughts and far away, no doubt. Then she added a remark in which Beaupère, always watchful, always alert, detected a possible opening, a chance to set a trap. Do you think he jumped at it instantly, betraying the joy he had in his mind, as a young hand at craft and artifice would do? No. Oh, no. You could not tell that he had noticed the remark at all. He slid indifferently away from it at once and began to ask idle questions about other things, so as to slip around and spring on it from behind, so to speak, tedious and empty questions as to whether the voice had told her she would escape from this prison, and if it had furnished answers to be used by her in today's scenes, if it was accompanied with a glory of light, if it had eyes, etc. That risky remark of Joan's was this: without the grace of God I could do nothing. The court saw the priest's game, and watched his play with a cruel eagerness. Poor Joan was grown dreamy and absent. Possibly she was tired. Her life was in imminent danger, and she did not suspect it. The time was ripe now, and Beaupère quietly and stealthily sprang his trap. "Are you in a state of grace?" "Ah!" We had 2 or 3 honorable brave men in that pack of judges, and Jean Lefebvre was one of them. He sprang to his feet and cried out, "It is a terrible question. The accused is not obliged to answer it." Caution's face flushed black with anger to see this plank flung to the perishing child, and he shouted, "Silence, and take your seat. The accused will answer the question." There was no hope, no way out of the dilemma, for whether she said yes or whether she said no, it would be all the same a disastrous answer, for the scriptures had said one cannot know this thing. Think what hard hearts they were to set this fatal snare for that ignorant young girl, and be proud of such work and happy in it. It was a miserable moment for me while we waited. It seemed a year. All the house showed excitement, and mainly it was glad excitement. Joan looked out upon these hungering faces with innocent, untroubled eyes, and then humbly and gently she brought out that immortal answer which brushed the formidable snare away as it had been but a cobweb. "Ah, you will never see an effect like that. No, not while you live." For a space there was a silence of the grave. Men looked wondering into each other's faces, and some were awed and crossed themselves, and I heard Lefebvre mutter, "It was beyond the wisdom of man to devise that answer. Whence comes this child's amazing inspirations?" Beaupère presently took up his word again, but the humiliation of his defeat weighed upon him, and he made but a rambling and dreary business of it, he not being able to put any heart in it. Then the priest finished by touching again upon the matter of her apparel, a matter which was never to be lost sight of in this still hunt for this innocent creature's life, but kept always hanging over her, a menace charged with mournful possibilities. 8. Joan tells of her visions. The court met next on Monday, the 27th. Would you believe it? The bishop ignored the contract limiting the examination to matters set down in the process verbal, and again commanded Joan to take the oath without reservations. She said, "You should be content I have sworn enough." The examination was resumed, concerning Joan's voices. "You have said that you recognized them as being the voices of angels the 3rd time that you heard them. What angels were they? How did you know that it was those 2 saints? How could you tell the one from the other?" "It was the voice of Saint Michael. I saw him before my eyes, and he was not alone, but attended by a cloud of angels." "Did you see the archangel and the attendant angels in the body or in the spirit?" "It made me see that awful shadow again that fell dazzling white upon her that day under l'Arbre de Beaumont, and it made me shiver again, though it was so long ago. It was really not very long gone by, but it seemed so because so much had happened since. As to that, I have not received permission to speak. What did the archangel say to you that first time?" "I will say again, as I have said before many times in these sittings, that I answered all questions of this sort before the court at Poitiers, and I would that you would bring here the record of that court and read from that. Prithee, send for that book." There was no answer. It was a subject that had to be got around and put aside. That book had wisely been gotten out of the way, for it contained things which would be very awkward here. Among them was a decision that Joan's mission was from God, whereas it was the intention of this inferior court to show that it was from the devil. Also a decision permitting Joan to wear male attire, whereas it was the purpose of this court to make the male attire do hurtful work against her. How was it that you were moved to come into France? By your own desire. Yes, and by command of God. But that it was his will I would not have come. I would sooner have had my body torn in sunder by horses and come, lacking that. Beaupère shifted once more to the matter of the male attire, now, and proceeded to make a solemn talk about it. That tried Joan's patience, and presently she interrupted and said, "It is a trifling thing and of no consequence. And I did not put it on by counsel of any man, but by command of God. Robert de Baudricourt did not order you to wear it. No. Did you think you did well in taking the dress of a man? I did well to do whatsoever thing God commanded me to do. I have done nothing but by command of God. Was there an angel above the king's head the first time you saw him? By the blessed Mary. She forced her impatience down and finished the sentence with tranquility. If there was one, I did not see it. Was there light? There were more than 3,000 soldiers there, and 500 torches, without taking account of spiritual light. What made the king believe in the revelations which you brought him? What revelations were made to the king? Presently she added, during 3 weeks I was questioned by the clergy at Chinon and Poitiers. The king had a sign before he would believe, and the clergy were of opinion that my acts were good and not evil. The subject was dropped now for a while, and Beaupère took up the matter of the miraculous sword of Fibrois to see if he could not find a chance that had fixed the crime of sorcery upon Joan. Joan had no concealments to make as to this. I knew the sword was there because my voices told me so, and I sent to ask that it be given to me to carry in the wars. It seemed to me that it was not very deep in the ground. The clergy of the church caused it to be sought for and dug up, and they polished it, and the rust fell easily off from it. Were you wearing it when you were taken in battle at Compiègne? No, but I wore it constantly until I left Saint Denis after the attack upon Paris. This sword, so mysteriously discovered and so long and so constantly victorious, was suspected of being under the protection of enchantment. She loved it because it had been built in honor of one of her angels. Didn't you lay it upon the altar, to the end that it might be lucky? The altar of Saint Denis. No. Truly it were no harm to wish that my harness might be fortunate. The sword of the Burgundian Franquet d'Arras, whom I took prisoner in the engagement at Lagny. I kept it because it was a good war sword, good to lay on stout thumps and blows with. She said that quite simply, and the contrast between her delicate little self and the grim soldier words which he dropped with such easy familiarity from her lips made many spectators smile. Is that in the process verbal? Beaupère did not answer. Her eye lighted gladly at the mention of a banner, and she cried out, I love my banner best. Oh, 40 times more than the sword. Sometimes I carried it myself when I charged the enemy, to avoid killing anyone. Then she added, naively, and with again that curious contrast between her girlish little personality and her subject, I have never killed anyone. In the final assault at Orleans, did you tell your soldiers that the arrows shot by the enemy and the stones discharged from their catapults would not strike anyone but you? Did you know that you were going to be wounded? I offered him leave to go out unhurt from the place, with all his garrison, and if he would not, I would take it by storm. And you did, I believe. Yes. As to that, I do not remember. Was the court discouraged? No. Naturally, it was very much surprised, very much astonished, to find its work baffling and difficult instead of simple and easy, but it had powerful allies in the shape of hunger, cold, fatigue, persecution, deception, and treachery, and opposed to this array nothing but a defenseless and ignorant girl who must some time or other surrender to bodily and mental exhaustion or get caught in one of the 1,000 traps set for her. It would have been foolish to doubt these things, for we all know that the air is full of devils and angels that are visible to traffickers in magic on the one hand and to the stainlessly holy on the other. But what many and perhaps most did doubt was that Joan's visions, voices, and miracles came from God. It was hoped that in time they could be proven to have been of satanic origin. Therefore, as you see, the court's persistent fashion of coming back to that subject every little while and spooking around it and prying into it was not to pass the time. It had a strictly business end in view. The next sitting opened on Thursday, the 1st of March. 58 judges present, the others resting. Here was a chance. We had 2 or 3 popes. Then, only one of them could be the true pope, of course. Everybody judiciously shirked the question of which was the true pope and refrained from naming him, it being clearly dangerous to go into particulars in this matter. Here was an opportunity to trick an unadvised girl into bringing herself into peril, and the unfair judge lost no time in taking advantage of it. He asked, in a plausibly indolent and absent way, "Which one do you consider to be the true pope?" The house took an attitude of deep attention, and so waited to hear the answer and see the prey walk into the trap. But when the answer came, it covered the judge with confusion, and you could see many people covertly chuckling. For Joan asked in a voice and manner which almost deceived even me, so innocent it seemed, "Are there two?" As soon as the judge was better of his embarrassment, he came back to the charge, but was prudent and passed by Joan's question. "Is it true that you received a letter from the Count of Armagnac asking you which of the three popes he ought to obey?" "Yes," and answered it. Copies of both letters were produced and read. Joan said that hers had not been quite strictly copied. She said she had received the Count's letter when she was just mounting her horse, and added, "I was not able to instruct the Count of Armagnac as to which one he ought to obey." Then she added, with a frank fearlessness which sounded fresh and wholesome in the den of trimmers and shufflers, "But as for me, I hold that we are bound to obey our Lord the Pope who is at Rome." The matter was dropped. They produced and read a copy of Joan's first effort at dictating, her proclamation summoning the English to retire from the siege of Orleans and vacate France. Truly a great and fine production for an unpracticed girl of 17. Do you acknowledge as your own the document which has just been read? Yes, except that there are errors in it, words which make me give myself too much importance. I saw what was coming. I was troubled and ashamed. For instance, I did not say deliver up to the maid, rendez-vous la pucelle. I said deliver up to the king, rendez-vous roi, and I did not call myself commander-in-chief, chef de guerre. All those are words which my secretary substituted, or mayhap he misheard me or forgot what I said. Ah, there would have been a fine and disagreeable episode for me there if that pitiless court had discovered that the very scribbler of that piece of dictation, secretary to Joan of Arc, was present, and not only present, but helping build the record, and not only that, but destined at a far distant day to testify against lies and perversions smuggled into it by caution and deliver them over to eternal infamy. Do you acknowledge that you dictated this proclamation? I do. Have you repented of it? Do you retract it? Ah! Then she was indignant. Silence. Sit down. And then, soon after, they will lose all France. Now consider these things. The French armies no longer existed. The French cause was standing still. Our king was standing still. There was no hint that by and by the Constable Richemont would come forward and take up the great work of Joan of Arc and finish it. In face of all this, Joan made that prophecy, made it with perfect confidence, and it came true. For within 5 years Paris fell, 1436, and our king marched into it flying the victor's flag. So the first part of the prophecy was then fulfilled. In fact, almost the entire prophecy. For, with Paris in our hands, the fulfillment of the rest of it was assured. 20 years later, all France was ours excepting a single town, Calais. Now that will remind you of an earlier prophecy of Joan's. At the time that she wanted to take Paris and could have done it with ease if our king had but consented, she said that that was a golden time, that, with Paris ours, all France would be ours in 6 months. But if this golden opportunity to recover France was wasted, said she, I give you 20 years to do it in. She was right. After Paris fell, in 1436, the rest of the work had to be done city by city, castle by castle, and it took 20 years to finish it. 25 years after Joan's death, the record was produced in the Great Court of the Rehabilitation and verified under oath by Mansion and me, and surviving judges of our court confirmed the exactness of the record in their testimony. They would have given their right hands to know the source of it. At last the questions began again. How do you know that those things are going to happen? This sort of answer was not going to allay the spreading uneasiness. Therefore, after some further dallying, the judge got the subject out of the way and took up one which he could enjoy more. What languages do your voices speak? French. Saint Marguerite. 2. Verily, why not? She is on our side, not on the English. Do your saints and angels wear jewelry, crowns, rings, earrings? To Joan, questions like these were profane frivolities and not worthy of serious notice. She answered indifferently, but the question brought to her mind another matter, and she turned upon caution and said, I had 2 rings. They have been taken away from me during my captivity. You have one of them. It is the gift of my brother. Give it back to me. If not to me, then I pray that it be given to the church. The judges conceived the idea that maybe these rings were for the working of enchantments. Where did you get it? My father and mother gave it to me. It is plain and simple and has Jesus and Mary engraved upon it. Now, as concerning the fairies that were used to abide near by Domrémy, whereof there are many reports and traditions. It is said that your godmother surprised these creatures on a summer's night dancing under the tree called l'Arbre de Beaumont. Is it not possible that your pretended saints and angels are but those fairies? Is that in your proses? She made no other answer. Have you not conversed with Saint Marguerite and Saint Catherine under that tree? I do not know. Or by the fountain near the tree? Yes, sometimes. None but such as they had God's warrant for. That is not in your proses. Yet I will say this much. They told me that the king would become master of his kingdom in spite of his enemies. And what else? There was a pause. Then she said humbly, Now you understand how the inquisitors were able to devise that long array of minutely prying questions. Questions whose subtlety and ingenuity and penetration are astonishing until we come to remember Loesel's performance and recognize their source. Aye, Bishop of Beauvais, you are now lamenting this cruel iniquity these many years in hell. Yes, verily, unless one has come to your help. There is but one among the redeemed that would do it, and it is futile to hope that one has not already done it, Joan of Arc. Did they make you still another promise? Yes, but that is not in your proses. I will not tell it now, but before 3 months I will tell it you. Joan often showed a little flash of surprise at the good guessing of the judges, and she showed one this time. I was frequently in terror to find my mind, which I could not control, criticizing the voices and saying, they counsel her to speak boldly, a thing which you would do without any suggestion from them or anybody else. But when it comes to telling her any useful thing, such as how these conspirators managed to guess their way so skillfully into her affairs, they are always off attending to some other business. I am reverent by nature, and when such thoughts swept through my head, they made me cold with fear, and if there was a storm and thunder at the time, I was so ill that I could but with difficulty abide at my post and do my work. Joan answered, That is not in your proses. I do not know when I shall be set free, but some who wish me out of this world will go from it before me. It made some of them shiver. Without a doubt they had, and the judge knew it before he asked the question. Ask me again in 3 months, and I will tell you. She said it with such a happy look, the tired prisoner. And I, and no rain guessing, drooping yonder. Why, the floods of joy went streaming through us from crown to sole. It was all that we could do to hold still and keep from making fatal exposure of our feelings. She was to be set free in 3 months. That was what she meant. We saw it. The voices had told her so, and told her true to the very day, May 30th. But we know now that they had mercifully hidden from her how she was to be set free, but left her in ignorance. Home again. That day was our understanding of it, Noel's and mine. That was our dream. And now we would count the days, the hours, the minutes. They would fly lightly along. They would soon be over. Our reading of the prophecy was this. We believed the king's soul was going to be smitten with remorse, and that he would privately plan a rescue with Joan's old lieutenants, d'Alencon and the Bastard and La Hire, and that this rescue would take place at the end of the 3 months. So we made up our minds to be ready and take a hand in it. In the present and also in later sittings, Joan was urged to name the exact day of her deliverance, but she could not do that. She had not the permission of her voices. Moreover, the voices themselves did not name the precise day. Ever since the fulfillment of the prophecy, I have believed that Joan had the idea that her deliverance was going to come in the form of death. But not that death. Divine as she was, dauntless as she was in battle, she was human also. She was not solely a saint, an angel. She was a clay-made girl also, as human a girl as any in the world, and full of a human girl's sensitivity and tenderness and delicacies. And so, that death? No, she could not have lived the 3 months with that one before her. I think, you remember that the first time she was wounded she was frightened and cried, just as any other girl of 17 would have done, although she had known for 18 days that she was going to be wounded on that very day. No, she was not afraid of any ordinary death, and an ordinary death was what she believed the prophecy of deliverance meant, I think, for her face showed happiness, not horror, when she uttered it. Now I will explain why I think as I do. 5 weeks before she was captured in the Battle of Compiègne, her voices told her what was coming. They did not tell her the day or the place, but said she would be taken prisoner and that it would be before the feast of St. John. She begged that death, certain and swift, should be her fate, and the captivity brief, for she was a free spirit and dreaded the confinement. The voices made no promise, but only told her to bear whatever came. Now, as they did not refuse the swift death, a hopeful young thing like Joan would naturally cherish that fact and make the most of it, allowing it to grow and establish itself in her mind. Then later, when she charged caution with trying to kill her with a poisoned fish, her notion that she was to be delivered by death in the prison, if she had it, and I believe she had, would naturally be greatly strengthened, you see. But I am wandering from the trial. Joan was asked to definitely name the time that she would be delivered from prison. Do your voices forbid you to tell the truth? Is it that you wish to know matters concerning the King of France? I tell you again that he will regain his kingdom, and that I know it as well as I know that you sit here before me in this tribunal. She sighed and, after a little pause, added, I should be dead but for this revelation, which comforts me always. Some trivial questions were asked her about St. Michael's dress and appearance. She answered them with dignity, but one saw that they gave her pain. After a little she said, I have great joy in seeing him, for when I see him I have the feeling that I am not in mortal sin. She added, sometimes St. Marguerite and St. Catherine have allowed me to confess myself to them. Here was a possible chance to set a successful snare for her innocence. But her reply did her no hurt. So the inquiry was shifted once more to the revelations made to the king, secrets which the court had tried again and again to force out of Joan, but without success. Now as to the sign given to the king. I have already told you that I will tell you nothing about it. Do you know what the sign was? All this refers to Joan's secret interview with the king, held apart, though 2 or 3 others were present. It was known, through L'Oiseleur, of course, that this sign was a crown and was a pledge of the verity of Joan's mission. But that is all a mystery until this day. The nature of the crown, I mean, and will remain a mystery to the end of time. We can never know whether a real crown descended upon the king's head, or only a symbol, the mystic fabric of a vision. Did you see a crown upon the king's head when he received the revelation? Did the king have that crown at Rheims? I think the king put upon his head a crown which he found there, but a much richer one was brought him afterward. They went on and pestered her to weariness about that mysterious crown, but they got nothing more out of her. The sitting closed. A long, hard day for all of us. 10 the inquisitors at their wits' end. The court rested a day, then took up work again on Saturday, the 3rd of March. This was one of our stormiest sessions. The whole court was out of patience, and with good reason. These 80 distinguished churchmen, illustrious tacticians, veteran legal gladiators, had left important posts where their supervision was needed, to journey hither from various regions and accomplish a most simple and easy matter, condemn and send to death a country lass of 19 who could neither read nor write, knew nothing of the wiles and perplexities of legal procedure, could not call a single witness in her defense, was allowed no advocate or advisor, and must conduct her case by herself against a hostile judge and a packed jury. In 2 hours she would be hopelessly entangled, routed, defeated, convicted. She was not doing that, for that was not her spirit, but others were doing it. The whole town was laughing in its sleeve, and the court knew it, and its dignity was deeply hurt. The members could not hide their annoyance. Next, the male attire was reverted to, of course. After many well-worn questions had been re-asked, one or two new ones were put forward. Did not the king or the queen sometimes ask you to quit the male dress? I have done best to serve and obey my sovereign lord and master. Did not your men copy your banner in their pennons? Were they often renewed? Whenever she flung out a scornful speech like that at these French menials in English livery, it lashed them into a rage. And that is what happened this time. There were 10, 20, sometimes even 30 of them on their feet at a time, storming at the prisoner minute after minute. But Joan was not disturbed. It was now sought to turn against Joan the 1,000 loving honors which had been done her when she was raising France out of the dirt and shame of a century of slavery and castigation. No. At Arras I saw a painting of myself kneeling in armor before the king and delivering him a letter, but I caused no such things to be made. Were not masses and prayers said in your honor? If they thought you were sent of God, do you think it was well thought? If they believed it, their trust was not abused. What impulse was it, think you, that moved the people to kiss your hands, your feet, and your vestments? They were glad to see me, and so they did those things, and I could not have prevented them if I had had the heart. Those poor people came lovingly to me because I had not done them any hurt, but had done the best I could for them according to my strength. See what modest little words she uses to describe that touching spectacle, her marches about France walled in on both sides by the adoring multitudes. They were glad to see me. Glad? Why, they were transported with joy to see her. When they could not kiss her hands or her feet, they knelt in the mire and kissed the hoof prints of her horse. They worshipped her, and that is what these priests were trying to prove. It was nothing to them that she was not to blame for what other people did. No, if she was worshipped, it was enough. She was guilty of mortal sin. Curious logic, one must say. At Troyes I did, and at St. Denis, and I named the boys Charles, in honor of the king, and the girls I named Joan. Yes, many did, but I did not know their reason for it. At Rheims was your standard carried into the church? Did you stand at the altar with it in your hand at the coronation? In the dress of a man? Yes, but I do not remember that I was in armor. It was almost a concession, almost a half surrender of the permission granted her by the church at Poitiers to dress as a man. The wily court shifted to another matter. To pursue this one at this time might call Joan's attention to a small mistake, and by her native cleverness she might recover her lost ground. The tempestuous session had worn her and drowsed her alertness. It is reported that you brought a dead child to life in the church at Lagny. Was that in answer to your prayers? As to that, I have no knowledge. Other young girls were praying for the child, and I joined them and prayed also, doing no more than they. Continue. While we prayed, it came to life, and cried. It had been dead 3 days, and was as black as my doublet. It was straightway baptized, then it passed from life again and was buried in holy ground. Why did you jump from the tower of Beaurevoir by night and try to escape? It was insinuated that this was an attempt to commit the deep crime of suicide to avoid falling into the hands of the English. Did you not say that you would rather die than be delivered into the power of the English? Joan answered frankly, without perceiving the trap. 11. The court reorganized for assassination. Something must be done, and it was done. Caution was not distinguished for compassion, but he now gave proof that he had it in his character. He thought it pity to subject so many judges to the prostrating fatigues of his trial when it could be conducted plenty well enough by a handful of them. Oh, gentle judge! But he did not remember to modify the fatigues, for the little captive. He would let all the judges but a handful go, but he would select a handful himself, and he did. He chose tigers. If a lamb or two got in, it was by oversight, not intention, and he knew what to do with lambs when discovered. He called a small council now, and during 5 days they sifted the huge bulk of answers as far gathered from Joan. They winnowed of all chaff, all useless matter, that is, all matter favorable to Joan. They saved up all matter which could be twisted to hurt, and out of this they constructed a basis for a new trial which should have a semblance of a continuation of the old one. Another change. It was plain that the public trial had wrought damage. Its proceedings had been discussed all over the town and had moved many to pity the abused prisoner. There should be no more of that. The sitting should be secret hereafter, and no spectators admitted. So Noel could come no more. I sent this news to him. I had not the heart to carry it myself. I would give the pain a chance to modify before I should see him in the evening. Do you know if St. Catherine and St. Marguerite hate the English? They love whom our Lord loves, and hate whom he hates. Does God hate the English? Of the love or the hatred of God toward the English I know nothing. Then she spoke up with the old martial ring in her voice and the old audacity in her words, and added, "But I know this, that God will send victory to the French, and that all the English will be flung out of France but the dead ones." It was a sufficiently naive way to account for a chastisement which had now strung out for 96 years. But nobody found fault with it. There was nobody there who would not punish a sinner 96 years if he could. No anybody there who would ever dream of such a thing as the Lord's being any shade less stringent than men. Yes, both of them. The evil face of caution betrayed satisfaction when she said that. When you hung garlands upon El Arbre Fi Beaumont, did you do it in honor of your apparitions? No. Yes, I did in the most honor and reverence that I could. A good point for caution if he could eventually make it appear that these were no saints to whom she had done reverence, but devils in disguise. Do you think it was right to go away to the wars without getting your parents' leave? It is written one must honor his father and his mother. I have obeyed them in all things but that, and for that I have begged their forgiveness in a letter and gotten it. Joan was stirred. Her eyes flashed, and she exclaimed, "I was commanded of God, and it was right to go. If I had 100 fathers and mothers, and been a king's daughter to boot, I would have gone." Did you never ask your voices if you might tell your parents? To the minds of the questioners, this headstrong conduct savored of pride. That sort of pride would move one to see sacrilegious adorations. Did not your voices call you daughter of God? Joan answered with simplicity and unsuspiciously, "Yes, before the siege of Orleans and since. They have several times called me daughter of God." Further indications of pride and vanity were sought. What horse were you riding when you were captured? Who gave it you? The king. You had other things, riches of the king. For myself I had horses and arms, and money to pay the service in my household. Had you not a treasury? Yes, 10 or 12,000 crowns. Then she said with naivete, it was not a great sum to carry on a war with. You have it yet? No, it is the king's money. My brothers hold it for him. What were the arms which you left as an offering in the church of St. Denis? My suit of silver mail and a sword. Did you put them there in order that they might be adored? No, it was but an act of devotion, and it is the custom of men of war who have been wounded to make such offering there. I had been wounded before Paris. Whether it was a standard or whether it was I, is nothing. The victories came from God. In neither, in God, and not otherwise. Then, soft and low, came that touching speech which will live as long as language lives, and pass into all tongues, and move all gentle hearts wheresoever it shall come, down to the latest day. It had borne the burden, it had earned the honor. 1. How simple it is, and how beautiful, and how it beggars the study's eloquence of the masters of oratory. Eloquence was a native gift of Joan of Arc. It came from her lips without effort and without preparation. Her words were as sublime as her deeds, as sublime as her character. They had their source in a great heart and were coined in a great brain. 1. What she said has been many times translated, but never with success. There is a haunting pathos about the original, which eludes all efforts to convey it into our tongue. It is as subtle as an odor and escapes in the transmission. Her words were these: Illinois of 8, a lapine, see tape being raised on Chulinois for the Eleanor. And you will remember how Joan, 16 years old, stood up in that venerable court and conducted her case all by herself, and tore the poor paladin's case to rags, and blew it away with a breath, and how the astonished old judge on the bench spoke of her as this marvelous child. You remember all that. Then think what I felt. To see these false priests, here in the tribunal wherein Joan had fought a fourth lone fight in 3 years, deliberately twist that matter entirely around and try to make out that Joan hailed the paladin into court and pretended that he had promised to marry her, and was bent on making him do it. Joan detailed the true history of the case, but lost her temper as she went along, and finished with some words for caution which he remembers yet. Whether he is fanning himself in the world he belongs in or has swindled his way into the other, the rest of this day and part of the next the court labored upon the old theme, the male attire. It was shabby work for those grave men to be engaged in, for they well knew one of Joan's reasons for clinging to the male dress was that soldiers of the guard were always present in her room whether she was asleep or awake, and that the male dress was a better protection for her modesty than the other. The court knew that one of Joan's purposes had been the deliverance of the exiled Duke of Orleans, and they were curious to know how she had intended to manage it. Her plan was characteristically businesslike, and a statement of it is characteristically simple and straightforward. I would have taken English prisoners enough in France for his ransom, and failing that, I would have invaded England and brought him out by force. That was just her way. If a thing was to be done, it was love first, and hammer and tongs to follow, but no shilly-shallying between. She added with a little sigh, If I had had my freedom 3 years, I would have delivered him. Have you the permission of your voices to break out of prison whenever you can? I have asked their leave several times, but they have not given it. Would you escape if you saw the doors open? She spoke up frankly and said, Yes, for I should see in the permission of our Lord. God helps who help themselves, the proverb says. But except I thought I had permission, I would not go. Now, then, at this point, something occurred which convinces me, every time I think of it, and it struck me so at the time, that for a moment, at least, her hopes wandered to the king and put into her mind the same notion about her deliverance which Noel and I had settled upon, a rescue by our old soldiers. I think the idea of the rescue did occur to her, but only as a passing thought, and that it quickly passed away. I do not know. St. Catherine has promised me help, but I do not know the form of it. I do not know whether I am to be delivered from this prison, or whether when you sent me to the scaffold there will happen a trouble by which I shall be set free. Without much thought as to this matter, I am of the opinion that it may be one or the other. After a pause, she added these words, memorable forever, words whose meaning she may have miscaught, misunderstood, as to that we can never know, words which she may have rightly understood, as to that, also, we can never know, but words whose mystery fell away from a many a year ago and revealed their meaning to all the world. But what my voices have said clearest is that I shall be delivered by a great victory. She paused. My heart was beating fast. For to me that great victory meant the sudden bursting in of our old soldiers with a war cry and clash of steel at the last moment, and the carrying off of Joan of Arc in triumph. But, oh, that thought had such a short life. For now she raised her head and finished, with those solemn words which men still so often quote and dwell upon, words which filled me with fear. They sounded so like a prediction. And always they say, submit to whatever comes. Do not grieve for your martyrdom. From it you will ascend into the kingdom of paradise. Was she thinking of fire and the stake? I think not. I thought of it myself. But I believe she was only thinking of the slow and cruel martyrdom of chains and captivity and insult. Surely, martyrdom was the right name for it. It was Jean de La Fontaine who was asking the questions. He was willing to make the most he could out of what she had said. I believe what they told me. I know that I shall be saved. It is a weighty answer. To me, the knowledge that I shall be saved is a great treasure. As to that, I do not know. My hope for salvation is in holding fast to my oath to keep my body and my soul pure. The snare was ingeniously devised, but Joan's simple and humble answer left it empty. One cannot keep his conscience too clean. We were now arriving at the last day of this new trial. Joan had come through the ordeal well. It had been a long and wearisome struggle for all concerned. All ways had been tried to convict the accused, and all had failed, thus far. The inquisitors were thoroughly vexed and dissatisfied. However, they resolved to make one more effort, put in one more day's work. This was done March 17th. Early in the sitting, a notable trap was set for Joan. That was well planned. Joan was in imminent peril now. If she should heedlessly say yes, it would put her mission itself upon trial, and one would know how to decide its source and character promptly. If she should say no, she would render herself chargeable with the crime of heresy. But she was equal to the occasion. She drew a distinct line of separation between the Church's authority over her as a subject member and the matter of her mission. She said she loved the Church and was ready to support the Christian faith with all her strength. But as to the works done under her mission, those must be judged by God alone, who had commanded them to be done. The judge still insisted that she submit them to the decision of the Church. She said, "I will submit them to our Lord who sent me. It would seem to me that he and his Church are one, and that there should be no difficulty about this matter." Then she turned upon the judge and said, "Why do you make a difficulty when there is no room for any?" Then Jean de La Fontaine corrected a notion that there was but one Church. There were two: the Church triumphant, which is God, the saints, the angels, and the redeemed, and has its seat in heaven, and the Church militant, which is our Holy Father the Pope, Vicar of God, the prelates, the clergy, and all good Christians and Catholics, the which Church is its seat in the earth, is governed by the Holy Spirit, and cannot Will you not submit those matters to the Church militant? I am come to the King of France from the Church triumphant on high by its commandant, and to that Church I will submit all those things which I have done. For the Church militant I have no other answer now. The court took note of this straightly worded refusal, and would hope to get profit out of it. But the matter was dropped for the present, and a long chase was then made over the old hunting ground, the fairies, the visions, the male attire, and all that. In the afternoon, the satanic bishop himself took the chair and presided over the closing scenes of the trial. Along toward the finish, this question was asked by one of the judges. "You have said to my lord the bishop that you would answer him as you would answer before our Holy Father the Pope, and yet there are several questions which you continually refuse to answer. Would you not answer the Pope more fully than you have answered before my lord of Beauvais? Would you not feel obliged to answer the Pope, who is the Vicar of God, more fully?" It made the bishop's purple face fairly blanch with consternation. If Joan had only known, if she had only known, she had lodged a mine under this black conspiracy able to blow the bishop's schemes to the four winds of heaven, and she didn't know it. She had made that speech by mere instinct, not suspecting what tremendous forces were hidden in it, and there was none to tell her what she had done. I knew, and Mansion knew, and if she had known how to read writing, we could have hoped to get the knowledge to her somehow. But speech was the only way, and none was allowed to approach her near enough for that. So there she sat, once more Joan of Arc the victorious, but all unconscious of it. She was miserably worn and tired, by the long day's struggle and by illness, or she must have noticed the effect of that speech and divined the reason of it. She had made many masterstrokes, but this was the masterstroke. It was an appeal to Rome. It was a clear right. And if she had persisted in it, caution's plot would have tumbled about his ears like a house of cards, and he would have gone from that place the worst beaten man of the century. He was daring, but he was not daring enough to stand up against that demand if Joan had urged it. But no, she was ignorant, poor thing, and did not know what a blow she had struck for life and liberty. France was not the Church. Rome had no interest in the destruction of this messenger of God. Rome would have given her a fair trial, and that was all that her cause needed. From that trial she would have gone forth free, and honored and blessed. But it was not so fated. Caution at once diverted the questions to other matters and hurried the trial quickly to an end. As Joan moved feebly away, dragging her chains, I felt stunned and dazed, and kept saying to myself, such a little while ago she said the saving word and could have gone free. And now, there she goes to her death. Yes, it is to her death. I know it. I feel it. They will double the guards. They will never let any come near her now between this and a condemnation, lest she get a hint and speak that word again. This is the bitterest day that has come to me in all this miserable time. 13. The third trial fails. There was no opportunity to do any thinking beforehand. There was no foreseeing what traps might be set, and no way to prepare for them. Truly it was a shabby advantage to take of a girl situated as this one was. One day, during the course of it, an able lawyer of Normandy, Maître Lohier, happened to be in Rouen, and I will give you his opinion of that trial, so that you may see that I have been honest with you, and that my partisanship has not made me deceive you as to its unfair and illegal character. Caution showed Lohier the process and asked his opinion about the trial. Now this was the opinion which he gave to Caution. He said that the whole thing was null and void, for these reasons. 1. Because the trial was secret, and full freedom of speech and action on the part of those present not possible. 2. Because the trial touched the honor of the King of France, yet he was not summoned to defend himself, nor anyone appointed to represent him. 3. Because the charges against the prisoner were not communicated to her. 4. Because the accused, although young and simple, had been forced to defend her cause without help of counsel, notwithstanding she had so much at stake. Did that please Bishop Caution? It did not. He burst out upon Lohier with the most savage cursings, and swore he would have him drowned. Lohier escaped from Rouen and got out of France with all speed, and so saved his life. Well, as I have said, the second trial was over, without definite result. But Caution did not give up. He could trump up another, and still another and another, if necessary. He had the half-promise of an enormous prize, the Archbishopric of Rouen, if he should succeed in burning the body and damning to hell the soul of this young girl who had never done him any harm, and such a prize as that, to a man like the Bishop of Beauvais, was worth the burning and damning of 50 harmless girls, let alone one. Opinions were taken, and the tribunal decided that Joan should hear the articles read this time. Joan was brought in, and the Bishop of Beauvais opened with a speech to her which ought to have made even himself blush. So laden it was with hypocrisy and lies. He said that this court was composed of holy and pious churchmen whose hearts were full of benevolence and compassion toward her, and that they had no wish to hurt her body, but only a desire to instruct her and lead her into the way of truth and salvation. The bishop was not expecting any other reply. He had made a show of fairness and could have entered on the minutes. Therefore he was satisfied. Then he commanded Joan to answer straightly to every accusation, and threatened to cut her off from the church if she failed to do that, or delayed her answers beyond a given length of time. Thomas de Courcelles began the reading of that interminable document, article by article. Joan answered to each article in its tone, sometimes merely denying its truth, sometimes by saying her answer will be found in the records of the previous trials. What a strange document that was, and what an exhibition and exposure of the heart of man, the one creature authorized to boast that he is made in the image of God. To know Joan of Arc was to know one who was wholly noble, pure, truthful, brave, compassionate, generous, pious, unselfish, modest, blameless as the very flowers in the fields, a nature fine and beautiful, a character supremely great. To know her from that document would be to know her as the exact reverse of all that. Nothing that she was appeased in it, everything that she was not appeased there in detail. There it is, every fact of her life distorted, perverted, reversed. As a child, she had loved the fairies. She had spoken a pitying word for them when they were banished from their home. She had played under their tree and around their fountain. Hence she was a comrade of evil spirits. She had lifted France out of the mud and moved her to strike for freedom, and led her to victory after victory. Hence she was a disturber of the peace, as indeed she was, and a provoker of war, as indeed she was again. And France will be proud of it and grateful for it for many a century to come. And she had been adored, as if she could help that poor thing, or was in any way to blame for it. The cowed veteran and the wavering recruit had drunk the spirit of war from her eyes and touched the sword with theirs and moved forward invincible. Hence she was a sorceress. And so the document went on, detail by detail, turning these waters of life to poison, this gold to dross, these proofs of a noble and beautiful life to evidences of a foul and odious one. Of course, the 66 articles were just a rehash of the things which had come up in the course of the previous trials, so I will touch upon this new trial but lightly. In fact, Joan went but little into detail herself, usually merely saying, "That is not true, passes outer," or "I have answered that before, let the clerk read it in his record," or saying some other brief thing. She refused to have a mission examined and tried by the earthly church. The refusal was taken note of. She denied the accusation of idolatry and that she had sought men's homage. She said, "If any kissed my hands and my vestments, it was not by my desire, and I did what I could to prevent it." She had the pluck to say to that deadly tribunal that she did not know the fairies to be evil beings. She knew it was a perilous thing to say, but it was not in her nature to speak anything but the truth when she spoke at all. Danger had no weight with her in such things. Note was taken of her remark. When one receives a sacrament, the manner of his dress is a small thing and of no value in the eyes of our Lord. It appears that this mission of yours, which you claim you had from God, was to make war and pour out human blood. As to the Duke of Burgundy, I required of him, both by letters and by his ambassadors, that he make peace with the king. As to the English, the only peace of them was that they leave the country and go home. Then she said that even with the English she had shown a pacific disposition, since she had warned them away by proclamation before attacking them. If they had listened to me, said she, they would have done wisely. At this point she uttered her prophecy again, saying with emphasis, "Before 7 years they will see it themselves." Then they presently began to pester her again about her male costume, and tried to persuade her to voluntarily promise to discard it. I was never deep, so I think it no wonder that I was puzzled by their persistency in what seemed a thing of no consequence, and could not make out what their reason could be. But we all know now that it was another of their treacherous projects. Yes, if they could but succeed in getting her to formally discard it, they could play a game upon her which would quickly destroy her. So they kept at their evil work until at last she broke out and said, "Peace! Without the permission of God, I will not lay it off though you cut off my head." At one point she corrected the process verbal, saying, "It makes me say that everything which I have done was done by the counsel of our Lord." I did not say that. I said all which I have well done. Doubt was cast upon the authenticity of a mission because of the ignorance and simplicity of the messenger chosen. Joan smiled at that. She could have reminded these people that our Lord, who is no respecter of persons, had chosen the lowly for his high purposes even oftener than he had chosen bishops and cardinals. But she phrased the rebuke in simpler terms. It is the prerogative of our Lord to choose his instruments where he will. She was asked what form of prayer she used in invoking counsel from on high. She said the form was brief and simple. Then she lifted her pallid face and repeated it, clasping her chained hands. "Most dear God, in honor of your holy passion I beseech you, if you love me, that you will reveal to me what I am to answer to these churchmen. As concerns my dress, I know by what command I have put it on, but I know not in what manner I am to lay it off. I pray you tell me what to do." She was charged with having dared, against the precepts of God and his saints, to assume empire over men and make herself commander-in-chief. That touched the soldier in her. She had a deep reverence for priests, but the soldier in her had but small reverence for a priest's opinions about war. So, in her answer to this charge, she did not condescend to go into any explanations or excuses, but delivered herself with bland indifference and military brevity. If I was commander-in-chief, it was to thrash the English. Death was staring her in the face all the time. But no matter. She dearly loved to make these English-hearted Frenchmen squirm, and whenever they gave her an opening, she was prompt to jab a sting into it. She got great refreshment out of these little episodes. Her days were a desert. These were the oases in it. Her being in the wars with men was charged against her as an indelicacy. She said, I had a woman with me when I could, in towns and lodgings. In the field I always slept in my armor. That she and her family had been ennobled by the king was charged against her as evidence that the source of her deeds was sordid self-seeking. She answered that she had not asked this grace of the king. It was his own act. He appointed a commission to reduce the substance of the 66 articles to 12 compact lies, as a basis for the new attempt. This was done. It took several days. Joan once more positively refused. Isambard de la Pierre had a heart in his body, and he so pitied this persecuted poor girl that he ventured to do a very daring thing. For he asked her if she would be willing to have her case go before the Council of Basel, and said it contained as many priests of her party as of the English party. Joan cried out that she would gladly go before so fairly constructed a tribunal as that. But before Isambard could say another word, Caution turned savagely upon him and exclaimed, "I," said poor Joan, reproachfully, "you set down everything that is against me, but you will not set down what is for me." It was piteous. It would have touched the heart of a brute. But Caution was more than that. We were now in the first days of April. Joan was ill. She had fallen ill the 29th of March, the day after the close of the third trial, and was growing worse when the scene which I have just described occurred in her cell. It was just like Caution to go there and try to get some advantage out of her weakened state. Let us note some of the particulars in the new indictment, the 12 lies. Another of the 12 says, she claims that she has never committed any sin. She never made any such claim. The 10th article was resentful against her for pretending that St. Catherine and St. The 12 were sent to Paris next day, April 5th. That afternoon there was a great tumult in Rouen, and excited crowds were flocking through all the chief streets, chattering and seeking for news. For a report had gone abroad that Joan of Arc was sick until death. In truth, these long seances had worn her out, and she was ill indeed. The heads of the English party were in a state of consternation. For if Joan should die uncondemned by the church and go to the grave unsmirched, the pity and the love of the people would turn her wrongs and sufferings and death into a holy martyrdom, and she would be even a mightier power in France dead than she had been when alive. Then Jean d'Estevette burst out on her, and called her names and abused her. He understood Joan to be charging the bishop with poisoning her, you see, and that was not pleasing to him, for he was one of Caution's most loving and conscienceless slaves, and it outraged him to have Joan injure his master in the eyes of these great English chiefs, these being men who could ruin Caution and would promptly do it if they got a conviction that he was capable of saving Joan from the stake by poisoning her, and thus cheating the English out of all the real value gainable by her, purchased from the Duke of Burgundy. He meant that to escape the stake she might undo the bandage and let herself bleed to death. But Caution was not touched. He made another of those conscienceless speeches of his, all dripping with hypocrisy and guile. He told Joan that among her answers had been some which had seemed to endanger religion, and as she was ignorant and without knowledge of the Scriptures, he had brought some good and wise men to instruct her, if she desired it. Said he, "We are churchmen, and disposed by our good will as well as by our vocation to procure for you the salvation of your soul and your body, in every way in our power, just as we would do the like for our nearest kin or for ourselves. In this we but follow the example of Holy Church, who never closes the refuge of her bosom against any that are willing to return. I seem to be in danger of death from this malady. If it be the pleasure of God that I die here, I beg that I may be heard in confession and also receive my Savior, and that I may be buried in consecrated ground." Caution thought he saw his opportunity at last. This weakened body had the fear of an unblessed death before it, and the pains of hell to follow. This stubborn spirit would surrender now. So he spoke out and said, "Then if you want the sacraments, you must do as all good Catholics do, and submit to the Church." He was eager for her answer, but when it came there was no surrender in it. She still stood to her guns. She turned her head away and said wearily. Caution's temper was stirred, And he raised his voice threateningly and said that the more she was in danger of death, the more she ought to amend her life. And again he refused the thing she begged for unless she would submit to the church. Joan said, "If I die in this prison, I beg you to have me buried in holy ground. If you will not, I cast myself upon my Savior." There was some more conversation of the like sort. Then caution demanded again, and imperiously, that she submit herself and all her deeds to the church. His threatening and storming went for nothing. That body was weak, but the spirit in it was the spirit of Joan of Arc, and out of that came the steadfast answer which these people were already so familiar with and detested so sincerely. Then the good theologians took turn about and worried her with reasonings and arguments and scriptures, and always they held the leer of the sacraments before her famishing soul, and tried to bribe her with them to surrender her mission to the church's judgment, that is, to their judgment, as if they were the church. But it availed nothing. I could have told them that beforehand, if they had asked me, but they never asked me anything. I was too humble a creature for their notice. The church calls upon you to submit. Disobey, and she will abandon you as if you were a pagan. Think of being abandoned by the church, that august power in whose hands is lodged the fate of the human race, whose scepter stretches beyond the furthest constellation that twinkles in the sky, whose authority is over millions that live and over the billions that wait trembling in purgatory for ransom or doom, whose smile opens the gates of heaven to you, whose frown delivers you to the fires of everlasting hell, a power whose dominion overshadows and belittles the pomps and shows of a village. To be abandoned by one's king, yes, that is death, and death is much, but to be abandoned by Rome, to be abandoned by the church, death is nothing to that, for that is consignment to endless life, and such a life. I could see the red waves tossing in that shoreless lake of fire. I could see the black myriads of the damned rise out of them and struggle and sink and rise again. And I knew that Joan was seeing what I saw, while she paused musing. And I believed that she must yield now, and in truth I hoped she would. For these men were able to make the threat good and deliver her over to eternal suffering, and I knew that it was in their natures to do it. But I was foolish to think that thought and hope that hope. Joan of Arc was not made as others are made. Fidelity to principle, fidelity to truth, fidelity to her word, all these were in her bone and in her flesh. They were parts of her. She could not change. She could not cast them out. She was the very genius of fidelity. She was steadfastness incarnated. Where she had taken a stand and planted her foot, there she would abide. Hell itself could not move her from that place. I am a good Christian born and baptized, and a good Christian I will die. 2 weeks went by. The 2nd of May was come. The chill was departed out of the air. The wild flowers were springing in the glades and glens. The birds were piping in the woods. All nature was brilliant with sunshine. All spirits were renewed and refreshed. All hearts glad. The world was alive with hope and cheer. The plain beyond the Seine stretched away soft and rich and green. The river was limpid and lovely. The leafy islands were dainty to see, and flung still daintier reflections of themselves upon the shining water, and from the tall bluffs above the bridge Rouen was become again a delight to the eye, the most exquisite and satisfying picture of a town that nestles under the arch of heaven anywhere. When I say that all hearts were glad and hopeful, I mean it in a general sense. There were exceptions. We were the friends of Joan of Arc, also Joan of Arc herself, that poor girl shut up there in that frowning stretch of mighty walls and towers, brooding in darkness, so close to the flooding downpour of sunshine, yet so impossibly far away from it, so longing for any little glimpse of it, yet so implacably denied it by those wolves in the black gowns who were plotting her death and the blackening of a good name. Caution was ready to go on with his miserable work. He had a new scheme to try now. He would see what persuasion could do. Argument, eloquence, poured out upon the incorrigible captive from the mouth of a trained expert. That was his plan. But the reading of the 12 Articles to her was not a part of it. No, even Caution was ashamed to lay that monstrosity before her. Even he had a remnant of shame in him, away down deep, 1,000,000 fathoms deep, and that remnant asserted itself now and prevailed. On this fair 2nd of May, then, the black company gathered itself together in the spacious chamber at the end of the great hall of the castle, the Bishop of Beauvais on his throne, and 62 minor judges massed before him, with the guards and recorders at their stations and the orator at his desk. Then we heard the far clank of chains, and presently Joan entered with her keepers and took a seat upon her isolated bench. She was looking well now, and most fair and beautiful after her fortnight's rest from wordy persecution. She glanced about and noted the orator. Doubtless she divined the situation. "Read your book, and then I will answer you." Every now and then he stopped and asked questions, and Joan replied. The nature of the church militant was explained, and once more Joan was asked to submit herself to it. She gave her usual answer. Then she was asked, "Do you believe the church can err?" "I believe it cannot err, but for those deeds and words of mine which were done and uttered by command of God, I will answer to him alone." "Will you say that you have no judge upon earth? Is not our Holy Father the Pope your judge?" "I will say nothing about it. I have a good master who is our Lord, and to him I will submit all." "If you do not submit to the church, you will be pronounced a heretic by these judges here present and burned at the stake." "I will not say otherwise than I have said already, and if I saw the fire before me, I would say it again." Superba responsio. Yes, it was just that, for the superb answer came from the lips of a girl of 19 with death and hell staring her in the face. They set several traps for her in a tentative form. That is to say, they placed supposititious propositions before her and cunningly tried to commit her to one end of the propositions without committing themselves to the other. But she always saw the game and spoiled it. The trap was in this form. Her answer was always in this form or to this effect. Yes, Joan was at her best that 2nd of May. She had all her wits about her, and they could not catch her anywhere. It was a long, long session, and all the old ground was fought over again, foot by foot, and the oratory expert worked all his persuasions, all his eloquence. But the result was a familiar one, a drawn battle, the 62 retiring upon their base, the solitary enemy holding her original position within her original lines. The brilliant weather, the heavenly weather, the bewitching weather made everybody's heart to sing, as I have told you. Yes, Rouen was feeling light-hearted and gay, and most willing and ready to break out and laugh upon the least occasion. And so when the news went around that the young girl in the tower had scored another defeat against Bishop Caution, there was abundant laughter among the citizens of both parties, for they all hated the bishop. It is true, the English-hearted majority of the people wanted Joan burned, but that did not keep them from laughing at the man they hated. It would have been perilous for anybody to laugh at the English chiefs or at the majority of Caution's assistant judges, but to laugh at Caution or D'Estevet and Loeseleur was safe. Nobody would report it. Some of the jokes got well worn in the course of 2 or 3 months, from repeated use. For every time Caution started a new trial, the folks said the sours lit it to again, and every time the trial failed, they said it over again, with its other meaning. The hog has made a mess of it. And so, on the 3rd of May, Noel and I, drifting about the town, heard many a wide-mouthed lout let go his joke and his laugh, and then moved to the next group, proud of his wit and happy, to work it off again. O.D.'s blood, the sow has lit it 5 times, and 5 times has made a mess of it. Caution lived in the great palace of the Archbishop, and it was guarded by English soldiery. But no matter. There was never a dark night but the walls showed next morning that the rude joker had been there with his paint and brush. Yes, he had been there, and had smeared the sacred walls with pictures of hogs in all attitudes except flattering ones. Hogs clothed in a bishop's vestments, and wearing a bishop's mitre irreverently cocked on the side of their heads. Caution raged and cursed over his defeats and his impotence during 7 says. Then he conceived a new scheme. You shall see what it was, for you have not cruel hearts, and you would never guess it. Caution was there, and the vice-inquisitor and the abbot of St. Corneille, also 6 others, among them that false Loeseleur. The guards were in their places, the rack was there, and by it stood the executioner and his aides in their crimson hose and doublets, meat colour for their bloody trade. The picture of Joan rose before me stretched upon the rack, her feet tied to one end of it, her wrists to the other, and those red giants turning the windlass and pulling her limbs out of their sockets. It seemed to me that I could hear the bones snap and the flesh tear apart, and I did not see how that body of anointed servants of the merciful Jesus could sit there and look so placid and indifferent. This was a memorable session, but it was the shortest one of all the list. When Joan had taken her seat, a resume of her crimes was read to her. Then Caution made a solemn speech. He said that in the course of her several trials, Joan had refused to answer some of the questions and had answered others with lies, but that now he was going to have the truth out of her, and the whole of it. Her manner was full of confidence this time. He was sure he had found a way at last to break this child's stubborn spirit and make her beg and cry. He would score a victory this time and stop the mouths of the jokers of Rouen. You see, he was only just a man after all, and couldn't stand ridicule any better than other people. He talked high, and his splotchy face lighted itself up with all the shifting tints and signs of evil pleasure and promised triumph. Purple, yellow, red, green. They were all there, with sometimes the dull and spongy blue of a drowned man, the uncanniest of them all. And finally he burst out in a great passion and said, Then she made a great answer which will live forever, made it without fuss or bravado, and yet how fine and noble was the sound of it. There was no crushing that spirit. You should have seen Caution. Defeated again, and he had not dreamed of such a thing. I heard it said the next day, around the town, that he had a full confession all written out, in his pocket and all ready for Joan to sign. I do not know that that was true, but it probably was, for her marked sign at the bottom of a confession would be the kind of evidence, for effect with the public, which Caution and his people would particularly value, you know. Verily, it is a wonderful creature. She has laid her hand upon an accepted truth that is as old as the world, and it has crumbled to dust and rubbish under her touch. Now whence got she that marvelous insight? Finally, Caution broke out with a good deal of asperity in his voice, and ordered Joan back to her dungeon. That was a happy surprise for me. I was not expecting that the bishop would yield. When Mansion came home that night, he said he had found out why the torture was not applied. There were two reasons. One was a fear that Joan might die under the torture, which would not suit the English at all. The other was that the torture would affect nothing if Joan was going to take back everything she said under its pains. And as to putting her mark to a confession, it was believed that not even the rack would ever make her do that. So all Rouen laughed again, and kept it up for 3 days, saying, The sow has littered 6 times, and made 6 messes of it. And the palace walls got a new decoration, a mitred hog carrying a discarded rack home on its shoulder, and Loeseleur weeping in its wake. Many rewards were offered for the capture of these painters, but nobody applied. Even the English guard feigned blindness and would not see the artists at work. The bishop's anger was very high now. He could not reconcile himself to the idea of giving up the torture. It was the pleasantest idea he had invented yet, and he would not cast it by. So he called in some of his satellites on the 12th and urged the torture again. But it was a failure. Age has taught me charity of speech, but it fails me when I think of those 3 names, Caution, Courcelles, Loeseleur. 1 hog, pig. 17 supreme in direst peril. Another 10 days' wait. The great theologians of the treasury of all valuable knowledge and all wisdom, the University of Paris, was still weighing and considering and discussing the 12 lies. I had had but little to do these 10 days, so I spent them mainly in walks about the town with Noel. But there was no pleasure in them, our spirits being so burdened with cares, and the outlook for Joan growing steadily darker and darker all the time. And then we naturally contrasted our circumstances with hers, this freedom and sunshine, with her darkness and chains, our comradeship, with her lonely estate, our alleviations of one sort and another, with her destitution in all. Inaction, and brooding stillness, and thoughts that travel by day and night and day round and round in the same circle, and wear the brain and break the heart with weariness. I had had but little to do these 10 days, so I spent them mainly in walks about the town with Noel. But there was no pleasure in them, our spirits being so burdened with cares, and the outlook for Joan growing steadily darker and darker all the time. And then we naturally contrasted our circumstances with hers, this freedom and sunshine, with her darkness and chains, our comradeship, with a lonely estate, our alleviations of one sort and another, with her destitution in all. It was death in life, yes, death in life, that is what it must have been. And there was another hard thing about it all. Consider, if you would realize how great Joan of Arc was, remember that it was out of such a place and such circumstances that she came week after week and month after month and confronted the master intellects of France single-handed, and baffled their cunningest schemes, defeated their ablest plans, detected and avoided their secretest traps and pitfalls, broke their lines, repelled their assaults, and camped on the field after every engagement, steadfast always, true to her faith and her ideals, defying torture, defying the stake, and answering threats of eternal death and the pains of hell with a simple "let come what may, here I take my stand and will abide." Yes, if you would realize how great was the soul, how profound the wisdom, and how luminous the intellect of Joan of Arc, you must study her there, where she fought out that long fight all alone, and not merely against the subtlest brains and deepest learning of France, but against the ignoble deceits, the meanest treacheries, and the hardest hearts to be found in any land, pagan or Christian. She was great in battle. We all know that. Great in foresight, great in loyalty and patriotism, great in persuading discontented chiefs and reconciling conflicting interests and passions, great in the ability to discover merit and genius wherever it lay hidden, great in picturesque and eloquent speech, supremely great in the gift of firing the hearts of hopeless men and noble enthusiasms, the gift of turning haze into heroes, slaves and skulkers into battalions that march to death with songs on their lips. But all these are exalting activities. They keep hand and heart and brain keyed up to their work. There's the joy of achievement, the inspiration of stir and movement, the applause which hails success. The soul is overflowing with life and energy. The faculties are at white heat. Weariness, despondency, inertia, these do not exist. Yes, Joan of Arc was great always, great everywhere, but she was greatest in the Rouen trials. 18 condemned yet unafraid. 1. As to who the fiends were who were represented in Joan's voices. 2. As to whether her saint spoke French only. You understand, the university decided emphatically that it was fiends who spoke in those voices. It would need to prove that, and it did. It found out who those fiends were, and named them in the verdict: Belial, Satan, and Behemoth. This has always seemed a doubtful thing to me, and not entitled to much credit. I think so for this reason. If the university had actually known it was those three, it would for very consistency's sake have told how it knew it, and not stop with a mere assertion, since it had made Joan explain how she knew they were not fiends. Does not that seem reasonable? To my mind, the university's position was weak, and I will tell you why. It had claimed that Joan's angels were devils in disguise, and we all know that devils do disguise themselves as angels. Up to that point, the university's position was strong. But you see yourself that it eats its own argument when it turns around and pretends that it can tell who such apparitions are, while denying the like ability to a person with as good a head on his shoulders as the best one the university could produce. The doctors of the university had to see those creatures in order to know, and if Joan was deceived, it is argument that they in their turn could also be deceived, for their insight and judgment was surely not clearer than hers. As to the other point which I have thought may have proved a difficulty and cost the university delay, I will touch but a moment upon that and pass on. The university decided that it was blasphemy for Joan to say that her saint spoke French and not English, and were on the French side in political sympathies. I think that the thing which troubled the doctors of theology was this: they had decided that the three voices were Satan and two other devils, but they had also decided that these voices were not on the French side, thereby tacitly asserting that they were on the English side, and if on the English side, then they must be angels and not devils. Otherwise, the situation was embarrassing. The envoys brought the verdict to Rouen, and with it a letter for caution which was full of fervid praise. The university complimented him on his zeal in hunting down this woman whose venom had infected the faithful of the whole West, and as recompense it as good as promised him a crown of imperishable glory in heaven. Only that, a crown in heaven, a promissory note and no endorser, always something away off yonder, not a word about the archbishopric of Rouen, which was a thing caution was destroying his soul for. A crown in heaven. It must have sounded like a sarcasm to him after all his hard work. What should he do in heaven? He did not know anybody there. On the 19th of May, a court of 50 judges sat in the archiepiscopal palace to discuss Joan's fate. A few wanted her delivered over to the secular arm at once for punishment, but the rest insisted that she be once more charitably admonished first. So the same court met in the castle on the 23rd, and Joan was brought to the bar. Pierre Maurice, a canon of Rouen, made a speech to Joan in which he admonished her to save her life and her soul by renouncing her errors and surrendering to the church. He finished with a stern threat. If she remained obstinate, the damnation of her soul was certain, the destruction of her body probable. But Joan was immovable. She said. A deep silence followed now, which endured some moments. It lay upon me like a weight. I knew it for an omen. Then caution, grave and solemn, turned to Pierre Maurice. Have you anything further to say? Nothing, my lord. Prisoner at the bow, have you anything further to say? Nothing. Then the debate is closed. Tomorrow, sentence will be pronounced. Remove the prisoner. She seemed to go from the place erect and noble. But I do not know. My sight was dim with tears. 19, our last hopes of rescue fail. But how was this to be managed? Weeks had been spent already in trying to get her to surrender. Time wholly wasted. What was to persuade her now? Torture had been threatened. The fire had been threatened. What was left? Illness, deadly fatigue, and the sight of the fire, the presence of the fire. That was left. She had furnished another hint at the same time, that as soon as the pains were gone, she would retract the confession. That hint was also remembered. She had herself taught them what to do. You see, first, they must wear out her strength, then frighten her with the fire. Second, while the fright was on her, she must be made to sign a paper, but she would demand a reading of the paper. They could not venture to refuse this, with the public there to hear. Suppose that during the reading her courage should return, she would refuse to sign then. Very well, even that difficulty could be got over. They could read a short paper of no importance, then slip a long and deadly one into its place and trick her into signing that. Yet there was still one other difficulty. If they made her seem to abjure, that would free her from the death penalty. They could keep her in a prison of the church, but they could not kill her. That would not answer, for only her death would content the English. Alive, she was a terror, in a prison or out of it. She had escaped from 2 prisons already. But even that difficulty could be managed. Caution would make promises to her. In return, she would promise to leave off the male dress. He would violate his promises, and that would so situate her that she would not be able to keep hers. Her lapse would condemn her to the stake, and the stake would be ready. The world knows now that Caution's plan was as I have sketched it to you, but the world did not know at that time. There are sufficient indications that Warwick and all the other English chiefs except the highest one, the Cardinal of Winchester, were not let into the secret. Also, that only L'Ursula and Beaupère, on the French side, knew the scheme. Sometimes I have doubted if even L'Ursula and Beaupère knew the whole of it first. However, if any did, it was these 2. I do not need to tell you that there was no rest for me that night, nor for Noel. We went to the main gate of the city before nightfall, with a hope in our minds, based upon that vague prophecy of Joan's voices which seemed to promise a rescue by force at the last moment. The immense news had flown swiftly far and wide that at last Joan of Arc was condemned and would be sentenced and burned alive on the morrow, and so crowds of people were flowing in at the gate, and other crowds were being refused admission by the soldiery, these being people who brought doubtful passes or none at all. We scanned these crowds eagerly, but there was nothing about them to indicate that they were our old war comrades in disguise, and certainly there were no familiar faces among them. And so, when the gate was closed at last, we turned away grieved, and more disappointed than we cared to admit, either in speech or thought. The streets were surging tides of excited men. It was difficult to make one's way. Toward midnight, our aimless tramp brought us to the neighborhood of the beautiful church of St. Wen, and there all was bustle and work. The square was a wilderness of torches and people, and through a guarded passage dividing the pack, The boys were carrying planks and timbers and disappearing with them through the gate of the churchyard. We asked what was going forward. The answer was, scaffolds and the stake. Don't you know that the French which is to be burned in the morning? At dawn we were at the city gate again, this time with a hope which our wearied bodies and fevered minds magnified into a large probability. We had heard a report that the abbot of Jumièges with all his monks was coming to witness the burning. 20. The betrayal. We seem so delicately made, so destructible, so insubstantial, yet it is easier to reduce a granite statue to ashes than it is to do that with a man's body. The sight of the stake sent physical pains tingling down the nerves of my body, and yet, turn as I would, my eyes would keep coming back to it. Such fascination has the gruesome and the terrible for us. The space occupied by the platforms and the stake was kept open by a wall of English soldiery, standing elbow to elbow, erect and stalwart figures, fine and sightly in their polished steel, while from behind them on every hand stretched far away a level plain of human heads. And there was no window and no house top within our view, howsoever distant, but was black with patches and masses of people. But there was no noise, no stir. It was as if the world was dead. The impressiveness of the silence and solemnity was deepened by a leaden twilight, for the sky was hidden by a pall of low-hanging storm clouds, and above the remote horizon faint winkings of heat lightning played, and now and then one caught the dull mutterings and complainings of distant thunder. The distance was not great. It was but a few hundred yards, but short as it was a heavy tax upon one who had been lying chained in one spot for months, and whose feet had lost their powers from inaction. Yes, and for a year Joan had known only the cool damps of a dungeon, and now she was dragging herself through this sultry summer heat, this airless and suffocating void. As she entered the gate, drooping with exhaustion, there was that creature laceler at her side with his head bent to her ear. The moment Joan was seated on the platform, she closed her eyes and allowed her chin to fall, and so sat, with her hands nestling in her lap, indifferent to everything, caring for nothing but rest. And she was so white again, white as alabaster. And I could read as by print, in their marveling countenances, the words that were drifting through their minds. Can it be true, is it believable, that it is this little creature, this girl, this child with the good face, the sweet face, the beautiful face, the dear and bonny face, that has carried fortresses by storm, charged at the head of victorious armies, blown the might of England out of her path with a breath, and fought a long campaign, solitary and alone, against the massed brains and learning of France, and had won it if the fight had been fair. Well, I suppose that everything had been done which could be thought of to tire Joan's body and mind, but it was a mistake. One more device had been invented. This was to preach a long sermon to her in that oppressive heat. When the preacher began, she cast up one distressed and disappointed look, then dropped her head again. This preacher was Guillaume Hérode, an oratorical celebrity. He got his text from the 12 Lies. He emptied upon Joan all the calumnies in detail that had been bottled up in that mess of venom, and called her all the brutal names that the 12 were labeled with, working himself into a whirlwind of fury as he went on. But his labors were wasted. She seemed lost in dreams. She made no sign. She did not seem to hear. At last he launched this apostrophe. O France, how hast thou been abused? Thou hast always been the home of Christianity. But now, Charles, who calls himself thy king and governor, endorses, like the heretic and schismatic that he is, the words and deeds of a worthless and infamous woman. Joan raised her head, and her eyes began to burn and flash. The preacher turned to her. It is to you, Joan, that I speak, and I tell you that your king is schismatic and a heretic. By my faith, sir, I make bold to say and swear, on pain of death, that he is the most noble Christian of all Christians, and the best lover of the faith and the church. There was an explosion of applause from the crowd, which angered the preacher, for he had been aching long to hear an expression like this, and now that it was come at last it had fallen to the wrong person. He had done all the work. The other had carried off all the spoil. He stamped his foot and shouted to the sheriff, "Make her shut up." That made the crowd laugh. Joan had damaged the preacher's cause more with one sentence than he had helped it with 100. so he was much put out and had trouble to get a good start again. But he needn't have bothered. There was no occasion. It was mainly an English feeling mob. It had but obeyed a law of our nature, an irresistible law, to enjoy and applaud a spirited and promptly delivered retort, no matter who makes it. The mob was with the preacher. It had been beguiled for a moment, but only that. It would soon return. It was there to see this girl burnt, so that it got that satisfaction. Without too much delay, it would be content. Presently, the preacher formally summoned Joan to submit to the church. He made the demand with confidence, for he had gotten the idea from Loeseleur and Beaupere that she was worn to the bone, exhausted, and would not be able to put forth any more resistance. And, indeed, to look at her it seemed that they must be right. Nevertheless, she made one more effort to hold her ground, and said, wearily, I charge my deeds and words upon no one, neither upon my king nor any other. If there is any fault in them, I am responsible and no other. She was asked if she would not recant those of her words and deeds which had been pronounced evil by her judges. Her answer made confusion and damage again. I submit them to God and the Pope. The Pope once more. It was very embarrassing. Here was a person who was asked to submit a case to the church, and who frankly consents, offers to submit it to the very head of it. What more could anyone require? How was one to answer such a formidably unanswerable answer as that? The mob was getting impatient. It was beginning to put on a threatening aspect. It was tired of standing, tired of the scorching heat, and the thunder was coming nearer, the lightning was flashing brighter. It was necessary to hurry this matter to a close. Erad showed Joan a written form, which had been prepared and made already beforehand, and asked her to abjure. Abjure? What is abjure? I appeal to the Church Universal whether I ought to abjure or not. Erad exclaimed. She glanced up at those awful words, and for the first time she saw the stake in the mess of red coals, red and angrier than ever now under the constantly deepening storm gloom. She gasped and staggered up out of her seat, muttering and mumbling incoherently, and gazed vacantly upon the people and the scene about her like one who is dazed, or thinks he dreams, and does not know where he is. Sign, sign, from the priests. Sign, sign and be saved. And Loeseleur was urging at her ear, do as I told you. Do not destroy yourself. Ow, you do not do well to seduce me. The judges joined their voices to the others. Yes, even the iron in their hearts melted, and they said, O Joan, we pity you so. Take back what you have said, or we must deliver you up to punishment. And now there was another voice. It was from the other platform, pealing solemnly above the din, cautions, reading the sentence of death. I submit. They gave her no time to reconsider. They knew the peril of that. The moment the words were out of her mouth, Massieu was reading to her the abjuration, and she was repeating the words after him mechanically, unconsciously, and smiling, for her wandering mind was far away in some happier world. Then this short paper of 6 lines was slipped aside and a long one of many pages was smuggled into its place, and she, noting nothing, put a mark on it, saying, in pathetic apology, that she did not know how to write. But a secretary of the King of England was there to take care of that defect. He guided her hand with his own and wrote her name, Jehan. The great crime was accomplished. She had signed, what? She did not know, but the others knew. She had signed a paper confessing herself a sorceress, a dealer with devils, a liar, a blasphemer of God and his angels, a lover of blood, a promoter of sedition, cruel, wicked, commissioned of Satan, and this signature of hers bound her to resume the dress of a woman. Loeseleur pressed forward and praised her for having done such a good day's work. But she was still dreamy. She hardly heard. But how transient was that happiness! For Caution, without a tremor of pity in his voice, added these crushing words. Perpetual imprisonment. She had never dreamed of that. Such a thing had never been hinted to her by Loeseleur or by any other. Loeseleur had distinctly said and promised that all would be well with her. And the very last word spoken to her by Erad on that very platform, when he was urging her to abjure, was a straight, unqualified promise, that if she would do it, she should go free from captivity. Now, you men of the church, take me to your prison, and leave me no longer in the hands of the English. And she gathered up her chains and prepared to move. But alas, now came these shameful words from Caution, and with them a mocking laugh. Take her to the prison whence she came. The rumbling of a drum broke upon the stillness, and for just one moment she thought of the glorious deliverance promised by her voices. I read it in the rapture that lit her face. Then she saw what it was, her prison escort, and that light faded, never to revive again. And now her head began a piteous rocking motion, swaying slowly, this way and that, as is a way when one is suffering unwordable pain, or when one's heart is broken. Then drearily she went from us, with her face in her hands, and sobbing bitterly. 21 respited only for torture. They eye us no certainty that anyone in all Rouen was in the secret of the deep game which Caution was playing except the Cardinal of Winchester. Then you can imagine the astonishment and stupefaction of that vast mob gathered there in those crowds of churchmen assembled on the 2 platforms, when they saw Joan of Arc moving away, alive and whole, slipping out of their grip at last, after all this tedious waiting, all this tantalizing expectancy. Nobody was able to stir or speak for a while, so paralyzing was the universal astonishment. So unbelievable the fact that the stake was actually standing there unoccupied and its prey gone. The tumult was very great. Indeed, for a while, in the midst of it a chaplain of the cardinal even forgot the propriety so far as to opprobriously assail the august bishop of Beauvais himself, shaking his fist in his face and shouting, "By God, you are a traitor." He a traitor? Oh, far from it. He certainly was the last Frenchman that any Briton had a right to bring that charge against. Give yourself no uneasiness, my lord. We shall soon have her again. Perhaps the like tidings found their way all around, for good news travels fast as well as bad. At any rate, the ragings presently quieted down, and the huge concourse crumbled apart and disappeared. And thus we reached the noon of that fearful Thursday. We 2 youths were happy, happier than any words can tell, for we were not in the secret any more than the rest. Joan's life was saved. We knew that, and that was enough. France would hear of this day's infamous work, and then, why, then her gallant sons would flock to her standard by thousands and thousands, multitudes upon multitudes, and their wrath would be like the wrath of the ocean when the storm winds sweep it, and they would hurl themselves against this doomed city and overwhelm it like the resistless tides of that ocean, and Joan of Arc would march again. In 6 days, 7 days, 1 short week, noble France, grateful France, indignant France, will be thundering at these gates. Let us count the hours, let us count the minutes, let us count the seconds. Oh, happy day, oh, day of ecstasy, how our hearts sang in our bosoms. Do you think the exhausted prisoner was allowed to rest and sleep after she had spent the small remnant of her strength in dragging her tired body back to the dungeon? And so Joan put on the gown which Caution and his people had brought, and would come to herself by and by, and have at first but a dim idea as to when and how the change had come about. Caution went away happy and content. Joan had resumed woman's dress without protest. Also she had been formally warned against relapsing. He had witnesses to these facts. How could matters be better? Why, then she must be forced to do it. Did Caution hint to the English guards that thenceforth, if they chose to make their prisoners' captivity crueler and bitterer than ever, no official notice would be taken of it? Perhaps so, since the guards did begin that policy at once, and no official notice was taken of it. Yes, from that moment Joan's life in that dungeon was made almost unendurable. Do not ask me to enlarge upon it. I will not do it. Joan of Arc has relapsed. The witch's time has come. It stopped my heart. It turned my blood to ice. That was more than 60 years ago, but that triumphant note rings as clear in my memory today as it rang in my ear that long-vanished summer morning. We are so strangely made. The memories that could make us happy pass away. It is the memories that break our hearts that abide. Soon other voices took up that cry. Tens, scores, hundreds of voices. All the world seemed filled with the brutal joy of it. And there were other clamors, the clatter of rushing feet, merry congratulations, bursts of coarse laughter, the rolling of drums, the boom and crash of distant bands profaning the sacred day with the music of victory and thanksgiving. About the middle of the afternoon came a summons for Mansion and me to go to Joan's dungeon, a summons from Caution. But by that time distrust had already taken possession of the English and their soldiery again, and all Rouen was in an angry and threatening mood. We could see plenty of evidences of this from our own windows, fists shaking, black looks, tumultuous tides of furious men billowing by along the street. And we learned that up at the castle things were going very badly. Indeed, that there was a great mob gathered there who considered the relapse a lie and a priestly trick, and among them many half-drunk English soldiers. Moreover, these people had gone beyond words. They had laid hands upon a number of churchmen who were trying to enter the castle, and it had been difficult work to rescue them and save their lives. And so Mansion refused to go. He said he would not go a step without a safeguard from Warwick. So next morning Warwick sent an escort of soldiers, and then we went. Matters had not grown peaceful in the meantime, but worse. The soldiers protected us from bodily damage, but as we passed through the great mob at the castle, we were assailed with insults and shameful epithets. I bore it well enough, though, and said to myself, with secret satisfaction, in 3 or 4 short days, my lads, you will be employing your tongues in a different sort from this, and I shall be there to hear. To my mind, these were as good as dead men. How many of them would still be alive after the rescue that was coming? Not more than enough to amuse the executioner a short half-hour, certainly. It turned out that the report was true. Joan had relapsed. She was sitting there in her chains, clothed again in her male attire. She accused nobody. That was her way. It was not in her character to hold a servant to account for what his master had made him do, and her mind had cleared now, and she knew that the advantage which had been taken over the previous morning had its origin, not in the subordinate but in the master, Caution. Here is what had happened. While Joan slept, in the early morning of Sunday, one of the guards stole her female apparel and put her male attire in its place. When she woke, she asked for the other dress, but the guards refused to give it back. She protested and said she was forbidden to wear the male dress, but they continued to refuse. She had to have clothing, for modesty's sake. Moreover, she saw that she could not save her life if she must fight for it against treacheries like this, so she put on the forbidden garments, knowing what the end would be. She was weary of the struggle. Poor thing. We had followed in the wake of Caution, the Vice-Inquisitor, and the others, 6 or 8, and when I saw Joan sitting there, despondent, forlorn, and still in chains, when I was expecting to find her situation so different, I did not know what to make of it. The shock was very great. I had doubted the relapse perhaps. Possibly I had believed in it, but had not realized it. Caution's victory was complete. He had a harassed and irritated and disgusted look for a long time, but that was all gone now, and contentment and serenity had taken its place. His purple face was full of tranquil and malicious happiness. He went trailing his robes and stood grandly in front of Joan, with his legs apart, and remained so more than a minute, gloating over her and enjoying the sight of this poor ruined creature, who had won so lofty a place for him in the service of the meek and merciful Jesus, Savior of the world, Lord of the universe, in case England kept her promise to him, who kept no promises himself. Presently the judges began to question Joan. One of them, named Margery, who was a man with more insight than prudence, remarked upon Joan's change of clothing, and said, "There is something suspicious about this. How could it have come about without connivance on the part of others? Perhaps even something worse." "Thousand devils!" screamed Caution in a fury. "Will you shut your mouth? Why have you resumed this male habit?" I did not quite catch her answer, for just then a soldier's halberd slipped from his fingers and fell on the stone floor with a crash, but I thought I understood Joan to say that she had resumed it of her own motion. I was full of anxiety to hear her answer to that question, and when it came it was just what I was expecting. She said, quietly, "I have never intended and never understood myself to swear I would not resume it." I had been sure all along that she did not know what she was doing and saying on the platform Thursday, and this answer of hers was proof that I had not been mistaken. Then she went on to add this: "Nevertheless, You have abjured, and have especially promised to return no more to the dress of a man." Then Joan held out a fettered hand sorrowfully toward these unfeeling men and said, Caution sniffed scoffingly at that. Honor the compact which he and his had made with her? Yes, she answered, and then it came out that the voices had talked with her about the abjuration, told her about it, I suppose. She guilelessly reasserted the heavenly origin of her mission, and did it with the untroubled mien of one who was not conscious that she had ever knowingly repudiated it. So I was convinced once more that she had had no notion of what she was doing that Thursday morning on the platform. Finally, she said, "My voices told me I did very wrong to confess that what I had done was not well." Then she sighed, and said with simplicity, "But it was the fear of the fire that made me do so." That is, fear of the fire had made her sign a paper whose contents she had not understood then, but understood now by revelation of her voices and by testimony of her persecutors. Responsio mortifera. Yet you denied them on the scaffold. Then she made direct and clear affirmation that she had never had any intention to deny them, and that if she had made some retractions and revocations on the scaffold, it was from fear of the fire, and it was a violation of the truth. There it is again, you see. She certainly never knew what it was she had done on the scaffold until she was told of it afterward by these people and by her voices. And now she closed this most painful scene with these words, and there was a weary note in them that was pathetic. "I would rather do my penance all at once. Let me die. I cannot endure captivity any longer." Several among the company of judges went from the place troubled and sorrowful, the others in another mood. In the court of the castle we found the Earl of Warwick and 50 English waiting, impatient for news. As soon as Caution saw them, he shouted, laughing, "Think of a man destroying a friendless poor girl and then having the heart to laugh at it." The young can sink into abysses of despondency, and it was so with Noel and me now, but the hopes of the young are quick to rise again, and it was so with ours. We called back that vague promise of the voices, and said the one to the other that the glorious release was to happen at the last moment. That other time was not the last moment, but this is. It will happen now. The king will come, La Haye will come, and with them our veterans, and behind them all France. And so we were full of heart again, and could already hear, in fancy, that stirring music, the clash of steel and the war cries and the uproar of the onset, and in fancy see our prisoner free, her chains gone, her sword in her hand. But this dream was to pass also, and come to nothing. Late at night, when Mansion came in, he said, "I am come from the dungeon, and I have a message for you from that poor child." A message to me. If he had been noticing, I think he would have discovered that my indifference concerning the prisoner was a pretense. For I was caught off my guard, and was so moved and so exalted to be so honored by her that I must have shown my feeling in my face and manner. A message from me, your reverence. Yes, it is something she wishes done. She said she had noticed the young man who helps me, and that he had a good face, and did I think you would do a kindness for her? I said I knew you would, and asked her what it was, and she said a letter. Would you write a letter to her mother? And I said you would, but I said I would do it myself, and gladly. But she said no, that my labors were heavy, and she thought the young man would not mind the doing of this service for one not able to do it for herself, she not knowing how to write. Then I would have sent for you, and at that the sadness vanished out of her face. Why, it was as if she was going to see a friend, poor friendless thing. But I was not permitted. I did my best, but the orders remain as strict as ever. The doors are closed against all but officials. As before, none but officials may speak to her. So I went back and told her, and she sighed and was sad again. Now this is what she begs you to write to her mother. It is partly a strange message, and to me means nothing, but she said her mother would understand. You will convey her adoring love to her family and her village friends, and say there will be no rescue, for that this night, and it is the 3rd time in the 12-month, and is final, she has seen the vision of the tree. Yes, it is strange, but that is what she said, and said her parents would understand. And for a little time she was lost in dreams and thinkings, and her lips moved, and I caught in her muttering these lines, which she said over 2 or 3 times, and they seemed to bring peace and contentment to her. I set them down, thinking they might have some connection with a letter and be useful, but it was not so. They were a mere memory, floating idly in a tired mind, and they have no meaning, at least no relevancy. And when in exile wandering, we shall fainting yearn for glimpse of thee, oh, rise upon our sight. I wrote the letter. You will know what it cost me, without my telling you. I wrote it with the same wooden stylus which had put upon parchment the first words ever dictated by Joan of Arc, that high summons to the English to vacate France 2 years past, when she was a lass of 17. It had now set down the last ones which she was ever to dictate. Then I broke it, for the pen that had served Joan of Arc could not serve any that would come after her in this earth without abasement. The next day, May 29th, Caution summoned his serfs, and 42 responded. It is charitable to believe that the other 20 were ashamed to come. The 42 pronounced her a relapsed heretic, and condemned her to be delivered over to the secular arm. Caution thanked them. Then he sent orders that Joan of Arc be conveyed the next morning to the place known as the Old Market, and that she be then delivered to the civil judge, and by the civil judge to the executioner. That meant she would be burnt. Early the next morning, Wednesday, Martin Ladvenu and another friar was sent to Joan to prepare her for death, and Mansion and I went with them, a hard service for me. We tramped through the dim corridors, winding this way and that, and piercing ever deeper and deeper into that vast heart of stone, and at last we stood before Joan. But she did not know it. She sat with her hands in her lap and her head bowed, thinking, and her face was very sad. One might not know what she was thinking of her home, and the peaceful pastures, and the friends she was no more to see, of her wrongs, and her forsaken estate, and the cruelties which had been put upon her? Or was it of death, the death which she had longed for, and which was now so close? Or was it of the kind of death she must suffer? I hope not, for she feared only one kind, and that one had for her unspeakable terrors. I believe she so feared that one that with a strong will she would shut the thought of it wholly out of her mind, and hope and believe that God would take pity on her and grant her an easier one, and so it might chance that the awful news which we were bringing might come as a surprise to her at last. We stood silent a while, but she was still unconscious of us, still deep in her sad musings and far away. Then Martin Ladvenu said, softly, Joan. She looked up then, with a little start and a WAN smile, and said, Speak. Have you a message for me? The muffled notes of a tolling bell floated to our ears out of the distance. Now, the time is at hand. There was a long silence. The distant throbbings of the bell pulsed through it, and we stood motionless and listening. But it was broken at last. By fire. Oh, I knew it. She sprang wildly to her feet, and wound her hands in her hair, and began to writhe and sob, oh, so piteously, and mourn and grieve and lament, and turn to first one and then another of us, and search our faces beseechingly, as hoping she might find help and friendliness there. Poor thing, she that had never denied these to any creature, even a wounded enemy on the battlefield. Oh, I appeal to God the great judge, against the injustice which has been done me. There was none there that could endure it. They turned away, with the tears running down their faces. In a moment I was on my knees at her feet. At once she thought only of my danger, and bent and whispered in my ear, Up, do not peril yourself. Good heart. God bless you always. And I felt the quick clasp of her hand. Mine was the last hand she touched with hers in life. None saw it. History does not know of it or tell of it, yet it is true, just as I have told it. The next moment she saw Caution coming, and she went and stood before him and reproached him, saying, Bishop, it is by you that I die. He was not shamed, not touched, but said, smoothly, Ah, be patient, Joan. You die because you have not kept your promise, but have returned to your sins. Then Caution winced, and looked less placidly content than before, and he turned him about and went away. Joan stood a while musing. She grew calmer, but occasionally she wiped her eyes, and now and then sobs shook her body. But their violence was modifying now, and the intervals between them were growing longer. Finally she looked up and saw Pierre Maurice, who had come in with the bishop, and she said to him, "Master Peter, where shall I be this night? Have you not good hope in God?" "Yes, and by his grace I shall be in paradise." Now Martin Ladvigne heard her in confession. Then she begged for the sacrament. But how grant the communion to one who had been publicly cut off from the church, and was now no more entitled to its privileges than an unbaptized pagan? The brother could not do this, but he sent a caution to inquire what he must do. All laws, human and divine, were alike to that man. He respected none of them. He sent back orders to grant Joan whatever she wished. Her last speech to him had reached his fears. Perhaps it could not reach his heart, for he had none. The Eucharist was brought now to that poor soul that had yearned for it with such unutterable longing all these desolate months. It was a solemn moment. While we had been in the deeps of the prison, the public courts of the castle had been filling up with crowds of the humbler sort of men and women, who had learned what was going on in Joan's cell, and had come with softened hearts to do, they knew not what, to hear, they knew not what. We knew nothing of this, for they were out of our view, and there were other great crowds of the like caste gathered in masses outside the castle gates. And when the lights and the other accompaniments of the sacrament passed by, coming to Joan in the prison, all those multitudes kneeled down and began to pray for her, and many wept. And when the solemn ceremony of the communion began in Joan's cell, out of the distance a moving sound was borne moaning to our ears. It was those invisible multitudes chanting the litany for a departing soul. The fear of the fiery death was gone from Joan of Arc now, to come again no more, except for one fleeting instant. Then it would pass, and serenity and courage would take its place and abide till the end. 20 for Joan the martyr. At 9 o'clock the Maid of Orleans, deliverer of France, went forth in the grace of her innocence and her youth to lay down her life for the country she loved with such devotion, and for the king that had abandoned her. She sat in the cart that is used only for felons. In one respect she was treated worse than a felon, for whereas she was on her way to be sentenced by the civil arm, she already bore a judgment inscribed in advance upon a mitre-shaped cap which she wore. Heretic, relapsed, apostate, idolater. It is just and true what one of the histories has said. The poor and the helpless had nothing but their prayers to give Joan of Arc, but these we may believe were not unavailing. There are few more pathetic events recorded in history than this weeping, helpless, praying crowd, holding their lighted candles and kneeling on the pavement beneath the prison walls of the old fortress. And it was so all the way. Thousands upon thousands mass upon their knees and stretching far down the distances, thick sown with the faint yellow candle flames, like a field starred with golden flowers. But there were some that did not kneel. These were the English soldiers. They stood elbow to elbow, on each side of Joan's road, and walled it in all the way, and behind these living walls knelt the multitudes. When the preparations had been finished, all noise and movement gradually ceased, and a waiting stillness followed which was solemn and impressive. And now, by order of caution, an ecclesiastic named Nicholas Mitty preached a sermon, wherein he explained that when a branch of the vine, which is a church, becomes diseased and corrupt, it must be cut away or it will corrupt and destroy the whole vine. He made it appear that Joan, through her wickedness, was a menace and a peril to the church's purity and holiness, and her death therefore necessary. When he was come to the end of his discourse, he turned toward her and paused a moment. Then he said, Joan had been placed wholly apart and conspicuous, to signify the church's abandonment of her, and she sat there in her loneliness, waiting in patience and resignation for the end. Caution addressed her now. He had been advised to read the form of her abjuration to her, and had brought it with him. But he changed his mind, fearing that she would proclaim the truth, that she had never knowingly abjured, and so bring shame upon him in eternal infamy. He contented himself with admonishing her to keep in mind her wickednesses, and repent of them, and think of her salvation. Then he solemnly pronounced her excommunicate and cut off from the body of the church. With a final word, he delivered her over to the secular arm for judgment and sentence. Joan, weeping, knelt and began to pray. For whom? Herself? Oh, no, for the King of France. Her voice rose sweet and clear, and penetrated all hearts with its passionate pathos. She never thought of his treacheries to her. She never thought of his desertion of her. She never remembered that it was because he was an ingrate that she was here to die a miserable death. She remembered only that he was a king, that she was his loyal and loving subject, and that his enemies had undermined his cause with evil reports and false charges, and he not by to defend himself. And so, in the very presence of death, she forgot her own troubles to implore all in her hearing to be just to him, to believe that he was good and noble and sincere, and not in any way to blame for any acts of his, neither advising them nor urging them, but being wholly clear and free of all responsibility for them. Then, closing, she begged in humble and touching words that all here present would pray for her and would pardon her, both her enemies and such as might look friendly upon her and feel pity for her in their hearts. There was hardly one heart there that was not touched, even the English, even the judges showed it, and there was many a lip that trembled and many an eye that was blurred with tears. Yes, even the English cardinals, that man with a political heart of stone but a human heart of flesh. The secular judge who should have delivered judgment and pronounced sentence was himself so disturbed that he forgot his duty, and Joan went to her death unsentenced, thus completing with an illegality what had begun illegally and had so continued to the end. He only said to the guards, "Take her, and to the executioner, do your duty." All these things I saw, albeit dimly and blurred with tears, but I could bear no more. I continued in my place, but what I shall deliver to you now I got by others' eyes and others' mouths. Tragic sounds there were that pierced my ears and wounded my heart as I sat there, but it is as I tell you. The latest image recorded by my eyes in the desolating hour was Joan of Arc with the grace of a comely youth still unmarred, and that image, untouched by time or decay, has remained with me all my days. Now I will go on. If any thought that now, in that solemn hour when all transgressors repent and confess, she would revoke her revocation and say her great deeds had been evil deeds and Satan and his fiends their source, they erred. No such thought was in her blameless mind. She was not thinking of herself and her troubles, but of others and of woes that might befall them. And so, turning her grieving eyes about her, where rose the towers and spires of that fair city, she said, "Oh, Rouen, Rouen, must I die here, and must it be my tomb? Aye, Rouen, Rouen, I have great fear that you will suffer for my death." Not even yet could caution, that men without shame, endure to let her die in peace, but went toward her, all black with crimes and sins as he was, and cried out, "I am come, Joan, to exhort you for the last time to repent and seek the pardon of God." Then the pitchy smoke, shot through with red flashes of flame, rolled up in a thick volume and hid her from sight. And from the heart of this darkness her voice rose strong and eloquent in prayer, and when by moments the wind shredded somewhat of the smoke aside, there were veiled glimpses of an upturned face and moving lips. At last a mercifully swift tide of flame burst upward, and none saw that face any more nor that form, and the voice was still. Conclusion. After the martyrdom, Noel and I went back to Domrémy. But presently, when the constable Richemont superseded La Trémouille as the king's chief adviser and began the completion of Joan's great work, we put on our harness and returned to the field and fought for the king all through the wars and skirmishes until France was freed of the English. It was what Joan would have desired of us, and, dead or alive, her desire was law for us. All the survivors of the personal staff were faithful to her memory and fought for the king to the end. Mainly we were well scattered, but when Paris fell we happened to be together. Noel and I remained always together, and I was by his side when death claimed him. It was in the last great battle of the war. In that battle fell also Joan's sturdy old enemy Talbot. He was 85 years old, and had spent his whole life in battle. A fine old lion he was, with his flowing white menere and his tameless spirit. Yes, and his indestructible energy as well, for he fought as knightly and vigorous a fight that day as the best man there. La Hire survived the martyrdom 13 years, and always fighting, of course, for that was all he enjoyed in life. I did not see him in all that time, for we were far apart, but one was always hearing of him. She said I would live until those wars were forgotten, a prophecy which failed. If I should live 1,000 years, it would still fail. For whatsoever had touch with Joan of Arc, that thing is immortal. Members of Joan's family married, and they have left descendants. Their descendants are the nobility, but their family name and blood bring them honors which no other nobles receive or may hope for. You have seen how everybody along the way uncovered when those children came yesterday to pay their duty to me. It was not because they are noble, it is because they are grandchildren of the brothers of Joan of Arc. This better reason was that, now that the English had been finally expelled from the country, they were beginning to call attention to the fact that this king had gotten his crown by the hands of a person proven by the priest to have been in league with Satan and burned for it by them as a sorceress. Therefore, of what value or authority was such a kingship as that? Of no value at all. No nation could afford to allow such a king to remain on the throne. It was high time to stir now, and the king did it. That is how Charles VII came to be smitten with anxiety to have justice done the memory of his benefactress. He appealed to the Pope, and the Pope appointed a great commission of churchmen to examine into the fact of Joan's life and award judgment. The commission sat at Paris, at Domrémy, at Rouen, at Orleans, and at several other places, and continued its work during several months. It examined the records of Joan's trials. It examined the Bastard of Orleans, and the Duc d'Alencon, and d'Orleans, and Pasquerel, and Courcelles, and Isambard de la Pierre, and Mansion, and me, and many others whose names I have made familiar to you. Also they examined more than 100 witnesses whose names are less familiar to you, the friends of Joan in Domrémy, Vaucouleurs, Orleans, and other places, and a number of judges and other people who had assisted at the Rouen trials, the abjuration, and the martyrdom. And out of this exhaustive examination, Joan's character and history came spotless and perfect, and this verdict was placed upon record to remain forever. It was beautiful to hear the Duc d'Alencon praise Joan's splendid capacities as a general, and to hear the bastard endorse these praises with his eloquent tongue and then go on and tell how sweet and good Joan was, and how full of pluck and fire and impetuosity, and mischief, and mirthfulness, and tenderness, and compassion, and everything that was pure and fine and noble and lovely. He made her live again before me, and wrung my heart. I have finished my story of Joan of Arc, that wonderful child, that sublime personality, that spirit which in one regard has had no peer and will have none, its purity from all alloy of self-seeking, self-interest, personal ambition. In it no trace of these motives can be found, search as you may, and this cannot be said of any other person whose name appears in profane history. With Joan of Arc, love of country was more than a sentiment, it was a passion. She was a genius of patriotism. She was patriotism embodied, concreted, made flesh, and palpable to the touch and visible to the eye.